Paper 138, Training the Kingdom's Messengers. After preaching the Sermon on the Kingdom, Jesus called the 6 apostles together that afternoon and began to disclose his plans for visiting the cities around and about the Sea of Galilee. His brothers James and Jude were very much hurt because they were not called to this conference. Up to this time, they had regarded themselves as belonging to Jesus' inner circle of associates, but Jesus planned to have no close relatives as members of this corps of apostolic directors of the kingdom. This failure to include James and Jude among the chosen few, together with his apparent aloofness from his mother ever since the experience at Cana, was the starting point of an ever-widening gulf between Jesus and his family. This situation continued throughout his public ministry. They very nearly rejected him, and these differences were not fully removed until after his death and resurrection. His mother constantly wavered between attitudes of fluctuating faith and hope and increasing emotions of disappointment, humiliation, and despair. Only Ruth, the youngest, remained unswervingly loyal to her brother. Until after the resurrection, Jesus' entire family had very little to do with his ministry. If a prophet is not without honor save in his own country, he is not without understanding appreciation save in his own family. 1. Final Instructions. The next day, Sunday, June 23, A.D. 26, Jesus imparted his final instructions to the 6. He directed them to go forth 2 and 2 to teach the glad tidings of the kingdom. He forbade them to baptize and advised against public preaching. He went on to explain that later he would permit them to preach in public, but that for a season, and for many reasons, he desired them to acquire practical experience in dealing personally with their fellow men. Jesus purposed to make their first tour entirely one of personal work. Although this announcement was something of a disappointment to the apostles, still they saw, at least in part, Jesus' reason for thus beginning the proclamation of the kingdom, and they started out in good heart and with confident enthusiasm. He sent them forth by 2s, James and John going to Charessa, Andrew and Peter to Capernaum, while Philip and Nathanael went to Tarichea. Before they began this first 2 weeks of service, Jesus announced to them that he desired to ordain 12 apostles to continue the work of the kingdom after his departure, and authorized each of them to choose 1 man from among his early converts for membership in the projected corps of apostles. John spoke up, asking, "But Master, will these 6 men come into our midst and share all things equally with us who have been with you since the Jordan, and have heard all your teaching in preparation for this, our first labor for the kingdom?" And Jesus replied, "Yes, John, the men you choose shall become one with us, and you will teach them all that pertains to the kingdom, even as I have taught you." After thus speaking, Jesus left them. The 6 did not separate to go to their work until they had exchanged many words in discussion of Jesus' instruction that each of them should choose a new apostle. Andrew's counsel finally prevailed, and they went forth to their labors. In substance, Andrew said, "The Master is right. We are too few to encompass this work. There is need for more teachers, and the Master has manifested great confidence in us, inasmuch as he has entrusted us with the choosing of these 6 new apostles." This morning, as they separated to go to their work, there was a bit of concealed depression in each heart. They knew they were going to miss Jesus, and besides their fear and timidity, this was not the way they had pictured the kingdom of heaven being inaugurated. It had been arranged that the 6 were to labor for 2 weeks, after which they were to return to the home of Zebedee for a conference. Meantime, Jesus went over to Nazareth to visit with Joseph and Simon and other members of his family living in that vicinity. Jesus did everything humanly possible, consistent with his dedication to the doing of his Father's will, to retain the confidence and affection of his family. In this matter, he did his full duty and more. While the apostles were out on this mission, Jesus thought much about John, now in prison. It was a great temptation to use his potential powers to release him, but once more he resigned himself to wait upon the Father's will. 2. Choosing the Six. This first missionary tour of the six was eminently successful. They all discovered the great value of direct and personal contact with men. They returned to Jesus more fully realizing that, after all, religion is purely and wholly a matter of personal experience. They began to sense how hungry were the common people to hear words of religious comfort and spiritual good cheer. When they assembled about Jesus, they all wanted to talk at once, but Andrew assumed charge, and as he called upon them one by one, they made their formal reports to the Master and presented their nominations for the 6 new apostles. Jesus, after each man had presented his selection for the new apostleships, asked all the others to vote upon the nomination. Thus all 6 of the new apostles were formally accepted by all of the older 6. Then Jesus announced that they would all visit these candidates and give them the call to service. The newly selected apostles were 1. Matthew Levi, the customs collector of Capernaum, who had his office just to the east of the city, near the borders of Bathania. He was selected by Andrew. 2. Thomas Didymus, a fisherman of Tarichea and one-time carpenter and stonemason of Gadara. He was selected by Philip. 3. James Alphaeus, a fisherman and farmer of Caressa, was selected by James Zebedee. 4. Judas Alphaeus, the twin brother of James Alphaeus, also a fisherman, was selected by John Zebedee. 5. Simon Zelotes was a high officer in the patriotic organization of the Zealots, a position which he gave up to join Jesus' apostles. Before joining the Zealots, Simon had been a merchant. He was selected by Peter. 6. Judas Iscariot was an only son of wealthy Jewish parents living in Jericho. He had become attached to John the Baptist, and his Sadducee parents had disowned him. He was looking for employment in these regions when Jesus' apostles found him, and chiefly because of his experience with finances, Nathanael invited him to join their ranks. Judas Iscariot was the only Judean among the 12 apostles. Jesus spent a full day with the 6, answering their questions and listening to the details of their reports, for they had many interesting and profitable experiences to relate. They now saw the wisdom of the Master's plan of sending them out to labor in a quiet and personal manner before the launching of their more pretentious public efforts. 3. The Call of Matthew and Simon. The next day, Jesus and the 6 went to call upon Matthew, the customs collector. Matthew was awaiting them, having balanced his books and made ready to turn the affairs of his office over to his brother. As they approached the toll house, Andrew stepped forward with Jesus, who, looking into Matthew's face, said, "Follow me." And he arose and went to his house with Jesus and the apostles. Matthew told Jesus of the banquet he had arranged for that evening, at least that he wished to give such a dinner to his family and friends if Jesus would approve and consent to be the guest of honor. And Jesus nodded his consent. Peter then took Matthew aside and explained that he had invited one Simon to join the apostles and secured his consent that Simon be also bidden to this feast. After a noontide luncheon at Matthew's house, they all went with Peter to call upon Simon the Zealot, whom they found at his old place of business, which was now being conducted by his nephew. When Peter led Jesus up to Simon, the Master greeted the fiery patriot and only said, "Follow me." They all returned to Matthew's home, where they talked much about politics and religion until the hour of the evening meal. The Levi family had long been engaged in business and tax gathering. Therefore, many of the guests bidden to this banquet by Matthew would have been denominated publicans and sinners by the Pharisees. In those days, when a reception banquet of this sort was tendered a prominent individual, it was the custom for all interested persons to linger about the banquet room to observe the guests at meat, and to listen to the conversation and speeches of the men of honor. Accordingly, most of the Capernaum Pharisees were present on this occasion to observe Jesus' conduct at this unusual social gathering. As the dinner progressed, the joy of the diners mounted to heights of good cheer, and everybody was having such a splendid time that the onlooking Pharisees began, in their hearts, to criticize Jesus for his participation in such a light-hearted and carefree affair. Later in the evening, when they were making speeches, one of the more malignant of the Pharisees went so far as to criticize Jesus' conduct to Peter, saying, "How dare you to teach that this man is righteous when he eats with publicans and sinners, and thus lends his presence to such scenes of careless pleasure-making?" Peter whispered this criticism to Jesus before he spoke the parting blessing upon those assembled. When Jesus began to speak, he said, "In coming here tonight to welcome Matthew and Simon to our fellowship, I am glad to witness your light-heartedness and social good cheer. But you should rejoice still more because many of you will find entrance into the coming kingdom of the Spirit, wherein you shall more abundantly enjoy the good things of the kingdom of heaven. And to you who stand about criticizing me in your hearts because I have come here to make merry with these friends, let me say that I have come to proclaim joy to the socially downtrodden and spiritual liberty to the moral captives. Need I remind you that they who are whole need not a physician, but rather those who are sick? I have come not to call the righteous, but sinners." And truly this was a strange sight in all Jewry, to see a man of righteous character and noble sentiments mingling freely and joyously with the common people, even with an irreligious and pleasure-seeking throng of publicans and reputed sinners. Simon Zelotes desired to make a speech at this gathering in Matthew's house, but Andrew, knowing that Jesus did not want the coming kingdom to become confused with the Zealots' movement, prevailed upon him to refrain from making any public remarks. Jesus and the apostles remained that night in Matthew's house, and as the people went to their homes, they spoke of but one thing: the goodness and friendliness of Jesus. 4. The Call of the Twins. On the morrow, all 9 of them went by boat over to Charessa to execute the formal calling of the next 2 apostles, James and Judas, the twin sons of Alphaeus, the nominees of James and John Zebedee. The fishermen twins were expecting Jesus and his apostles, and were therefore awaiting them on the shore. James Zebedee presented the master to the Charessa fishermen, and Jesus, gazing on them, nodded and said, "Follow me." That afternoon, which they spent together, Jesus fully instructed them concerning attendance upon festive gatherings, concluding his remarks by saying, "All men are my brothers. My Father in heaven does not despise any creature of our making. The kingdom of heaven is open to all men and women. No man may close the door of mercy in the face of any hungry soul who may seek to gain an entrance thereto. We will sit at meat with all who desire to hear of the kingdom. As our Father in heaven looks down upon men, they are all alike. Refuse not, therefore, to break bread with Pharisee or sinner, Sadducee or publican, Roman or Jew, rich or poor, free or bond. The door of the kingdom is wide open for all who desire to know the truth and to find God." That night at a simple supper at the Alphaeus home, the twin brothers were received into the apostolic family. Later in the evening, Jesus gave his apostles their first lesson dealing with the origin, nature, and destiny of unclean spirits, but they could not comprehend the import of what he told them. They found it very easy to love and admire Jesus, but very difficult to understand many of his teachings. After a night of rest, the entire party, now numbering 11, went by boat over to Tarichea. 5. The call of Thomas and Judas. Thomas the fisherman and Judas the wanderer met Jesus and the apostles at the fisher boat landing at Tarichea, and Thomas led the party to his nearby home. Philip now presented Thomas as his nominee for apostleship, and Nathanael presented Judas Iscariot the Judean for similar honors. Jesus looked upon Thomas and said, "Thomas, you lack faith. Nevertheless, I receive you. Follow me." To Judas Iscariot the Master said, "Judas, we are all of one flesh, and as I receive you into our midst, I pray that you will always be loyal to your Galilean brethren. Follow me." When they had refreshed themselves, Jesus took the 12 apart for a season to pray with them and to instruct them in the nature and work of the Holy Spirit. But again did they largely fail to comprehend the meaning of those wonderful truths which he endeavored to teach them. One would grasp one point, and one would comprehend another, but none of them could encompass the whole of his teaching. Always would they make the mistake of trying to fit Jesus' new gospel into their old forms of religious belief. They could not grasp the idea that Jesus had come to proclaim a new gospel of salvation and to establish a new way of finding God. They did not perceive that he was a new revelation of the Father in heaven. The next day, Jesus left his 12 apostles quite alone. He wanted them to become acquainted and desired that they be alone to talk over what he had taught them. The Master returned for the evening meal, and during the after-supper hours he talked to them about the ministry of the seraphim, and some of the apostles comprehended his teaching. They rested for a night, and the next day departed by boat for Capernaum. Zebedee and Salome had gone to live with their son David, so that their large home could be turned over to Jesus and his 12 apostles. Here Jesus spent a quiet Sabbath with his chosen messengers. He carefully outlined the plans for proclaiming the kingdom and fully explained the importance of avoiding any clash with the civil authorities, saying, "If the civil rulers are to be rebuked, leave that task to me. See that you make no denunciations of Caesar or his servants." It was this same evening that Judas Iscariot took Jesus aside to inquire why nothing was done to get John out of prison. And Judas was not wholly satisfied with Jesus' attitude. 6. The week of intensive training. The next week was devoted to a program of intense training. Each day, the 6 new apostles were put in the hands of their respective nominators for a thoroughgoing review of all they had learned and experienced in preparation for the work of the kingdom. The older apostles carefully reviewed, for the benefit of the younger 6, Jesus' teachings up to that hour. Evenings they all assembled in Zebedee's garden to receive Jesus' instruction. It was at this time that Jesus established the midweek holiday for rest and recreation. And they pursued this plan of relaxation for one day each week throughout the remainder of his material life. As a general rule, they never prosecuted their regular activities on Wednesday. On this weekly holiday, Jesus would usually take himself away from them, saying, "My children, go for a day of play. Rest yourselves from the arduous labors of the kingdom, and enjoy the refreshment that comes from reverting to your former vocations, or from discovering new sorts of recreational activity." While Jesus, at this period of his earth life, did not actually require this day of rest, he conformed to this plan because he knew it was best for his human associates. Jesus was the teacher, the master. His associates were his pupils, disciples. Jesus endeavored to make clear to his apostles the difference between his teachings and his life among them, and the teachings which might subsequently spring up about him. Said Jesus, "My kingdom and the gospel related thereto shall be the burden of your message. Be not sidetracked into preaching about me and about my teachings. Proclaim the gospel of the kingdom and portray my revelation of the Father in heaven, But do not be misled into the bypaths of creating legends and building up a cult having to do with beliefs and teachings about my beliefs and teachings. But again, they did not understand why he thus spoke, and no man dared to ask why he so taught them. In these early teachings, Jesus sought to avoid controversies with his apostles as far as possible, excepting those involving wrong concepts of his Father in heaven. In all such matters, he never hesitated to correct erroneous beliefs. There was just one motive in Jesus' post-baptismal life on Urantia, and that was a better and truer revelation of his Paradise Father. He was the pioneer of the new and better way to God, the way of faith and love. Ever his exhortation to the apostles was, "Go seek for the sinners, find the downhearted, and comfort the anxious." Jesus had a perfect grasp of the situation. He possessed unlimited power, which might have been utilized in the furtherance of his mission, but he was wholly content with means and personalities which most people would have regarded as inadequate and would have looked upon as insignificant. He was engaged in a mission of enormous dramatic possibilities, but he insisted on going about his Father's business in the most quiet and undramatic manner. He studiously avoided all display of power. And he now planned to work quietly, at least for several months, with his 12 apostles around about the Sea of Galilee. 7. Another disappointment. Jesus had planned for a quiet missionary campaign of 5 months' personal work. He did not tell the apostles how long this was to last. They worked from week to week. And early on this first day of the week, just as he was about to announce this to his 12 apostles, Simon Peter, James Zebedee, and Judas Iscariot came to have private converse with him. Taking Jesus aside, Peter made bold to say, "Master, we come at the behest of our associates to inquire whether the time is not now ripe to enter into the kingdom, and will you proclaim the kingdom at Capernaum? Or are we to move on to Jerusalem? And when shall we learn, each of us, the positions we are to occupy with you in the establishment of the kingdom?" And Peter would have gone on asking further questions, but Jesus raised an admonitory hand and stopped him. And beckoning the other apostles standing nearby to join them, Jesus said, "My little children, how long shall I bear with you? Have I not made it plain to you that my kingdom is not of this world? I have told you many times that I have not come to sit on David's throne. And now, how is it that you are inquiring which place each of you will occupy in the Father's kingdom? Can you not perceive that I have called you as ambassadors of a spiritual kingdom? Do you not understand that soon, very soon, you are to represent me in the world and in the proclamation of the kingdom, even as I now represent my Father who is in heaven? Can it be that I have chosen you and instructed you as messengers of the kingdom, and yet you do not comprehend the nature and significance of this coming kingdom of divine preeminence in the hearts of men? My friends, hear me once more. Banish from your minds this idea that my kingdom is a rule of power or a reign of glory. Indeed, all power in heaven and on earth will presently be given into my hands, but it is not the Father's will that we use this divine endowment to glorify ourselves during this age. In another age you shall indeed sit with me in power and glory, but it behooves us now to submit to the will of the Father and to go forth in humble obedience to execute his bidding on earth." Once more were his associates shocked, stunned. Jesus sent them away 2 and 2 to pray, asking them to return to him at noontime. On this crucial forenoon they each sought to find God, and each endeavored to cheer and strengthen the other, and they returned to Jesus as he had bidden them. Jesus now recounted for them the coming of John, the baptism in the Jordan, the marriage feast at Cana, the recent choosing of the 6, and the withdrawal from them of his own brothers in the flesh, and warned them that the enemy of the kingdom would seek also to draw them away. After this short but earnest talk, the apostles all arose, under Peter's leadership, to declare their undying devotion to their Master, and to pledge their unswerving loyalty to the kingdom, as Thomas expressed it, to this coming kingdom, no matter what it is, and even if I do not fully understand it. They all truly believed in Jesus, even though they did not fully comprehend his teaching. Jesus now asked them how much money they had among them. He also inquired as to what provision had been made for their families. When it developed that they had hardly sufficient funds to maintain themselves for 2 weeks, he said, "It is not the will of my Father that we begin our work in this way. We will remain here by the sea 2 weeks and fish or do whatever our hands find to do, and in the meantime, under the guidance of Andrew, the first chosen apostle, you shall so organize yourselves as to provide for everything needful in your future work, both for the present personal ministry and also when I shall subsequently ordain you to preach the gospel and instruct believers." They were all greatly cheered by these words. This was their first clear-cut and positive intimation that Jesus designed later on to enter upon more aggressive and pretentious public efforts. The apostles spent the remainder of the day perfecting their organization and completing arrangements for boats and nets for embarking on the morrow's fishing, as they had all decided to devote themselves to fishing. Most of them had been fishermen. Even Jesus was an experienced boatman and fisherman. Many of the boats which they used the next few years had been built by Jesus' own hands, and they were good and trustworthy boats. Jesus enjoined them to devote themselves to fishing for 2 weeks, adding, "And then will you go forth to become fishers of men." They fished in 3 groups, Jesus going out with a different group each night. And they all so much enjoyed Jesus. He was a good fisherman, a cheerful companion, and an inspiring friend. The more they worked with him, the more they loved him. Said Matthew one day, "The more you understand some people, the less you admire them. But of this man, even the less I comprehend him, the more I love him." This plan of fishing 2 weeks and going out to do personal work in behalf of the kingdom for 2 weeks was followed for more than 5 months, even to the end of this year of AD 26, until after the cessation of those special persecutions which had been directed against John's disciples subsequent to his imprisonment. 8. First work of the 12. After disposing of the fish catches of 2 weeks, Judas Iscariot, the one chosen to act as treasurer of the 12, divided the apostolic funds into 6 equal portions, funds for the care of dependent families having been already provided. And then near the middle of August in the year AD 26, they went forth 2 and 2 to the fields of work assigned by Andrew. The first 2 weeks Jesus went out with Andrew and Peter, the second 2 weeks with James and John, and so on with the other couples in the order of their choosing. In this way he was able to go out at least once with each couple before he called them together for the beginning of their public ministry. Jesus taught them to preach the forgiveness of sin through faith in God without penance or sacrifice, and that the Father in heaven loves all his children with the same eternal love. He enjoined his apostles to refrain from discussing 1. The work and imprisonment of John the Baptist. 2. The voice at the baptism. Said Jesus, "Only those who heard the voice may refer to it. Speak only that which you have heard from me. Speak not hearsay." 3. The turning of the water into wine at Cana. Jesus seriously charged them, saying, "Tell no man about the water and the wine." They had wonderful times throughout these 5 or 6 months, during which they worked as fishermen every alternate 2 weeks, thereby earning enough money to support themselves in the field for each succeeding 2 weeks of missionary work for the kingdom. The common people marveled at the teaching and ministry of Jesus and his apostles. The rabbis had long taught the Jews that the ignorant could not be pious or righteous, but Jesus' apostles were both pious and righteous, yet they were cheerfully ignorant of much of the learning of the rabbis and the wisdom of the world. Jesus made plain to his apostles the difference between the repentance of so-called good works, as taught by the Jews, and the change of mind by faith, the new birth, which he required as the price of admission to the kingdom. He taught his apostles that faith was the only requisite to entering the Father's kingdom. John had taught them repentance to flee from the wrath to come. Jesus taught, faith is the open door for entering into the present, perfect, and eternal love of God. Jesus did not speak like a prophet, one who comes to declare the word of God. He seemed to speak of himself as one having authority. Jesus sought to divert their minds from miracle-seeking to the finding of a real and personal experience in the satisfaction and assurance of the indwelling of God's Spirit of love and saving grace. The disciples early learned that the Master had a profound respect and sympathetic regard for every human being he met, and they were tremendously impressed by this uniform and unvarying consideration which he so consistently gave to all sorts of men, women, and children. He would pause in the midst of a profound discourse that he might go out in the road to speak good cheer to a passing woman laden with her burden of body and soul. He would interrupt a serious conference with his apostles to fraternize with an intruding child. Nothing ever seemed so important to Jesus as the individual human who chanced to be in his immediate presence. He was master and teacher, but he was more. He was also a friend and neighbor, an understanding comrade. Though Jesus' public teaching mainly consisted in parables and short discourses, he invariably taught his apostles by questions and answers. He would always pause to answer sincere questions during his later public discourses. The apostles were at first shocked by, but early became accustomed to, Jesus' treatment of women. He made it very clear to them that women were to be accorded equal rights with men in the kingdom. 9. 5 months of testing. This somewhat monotonous period of alternate fishing and personal work proved to be a grueling experience for the 12 apostles, but they endured the test. With all of their grumblings, doubts, and transient dissatisfactions, they remained true to their vows of devotion and loyalty to the Master. It was their personal association with Jesus during these months of testing that so endeared him to them that they all, save Judas Iscariot, remained loyal and true to him, even in the dark hours of the trial and crucifixion. Real men simply could not actually desert a revered teacher who had lived so close to them and had been so devoted to them as had Jesus. Through the dark hours of the Master's death, in the hearts of these apostles, all reason, judgment, and logic were set aside in deference to just one extraordinary human emotion, the supreme sentiment of friendship-loyalty. These 5 months of work with Jesus led these apostles, each one of them, to regard him as the best friend he had in all the world. And it was this human sentiment, and not his superb teachings or marvelous doings, that held them together until after the resurrection and the renewal of the proclamation of the gospel of the kingdom. Not only were these months of quiet work a great test to the apostles, a test which they survived, but this season of public inactivity was a great trial to Jesus' family. By the time Jesus was prepared to launch forth on his public work, his entire family, except Ruth, had practically deserted him. On only a few occasions did they attempt to make subsequent contact with him, and then it was to persuade him to return home with them, for they came near to believing that he was beside himself. They simply could not fathom his philosophy nor grasp his teaching. It was all too much for those of his own flesh and blood. The apostles carried on their personal work in Capernaum, Bethsaida Julias, Chorazin, Gerasa, Hippos, Magdala, Cana, Bethlehem of Galilee, Jotapata, Ramah, Saphad, Gishala, Gadara, and Abela. Besides these towns, they labored in many villages as well as in the countryside. By the end of this period, the 12 had worked out fairly satisfactory plans for the care of their respective families. Most of the apostles were married, some had several children, but they had made such arrangements for the support of their home folks that, with some little assistance from the apostolic funds, they could devote their entire energies to the Master's work without having to worry about the financial welfare of their families. 10. Organization of the 12. The apostles early organized themselves in the following manner. 1. Andrew, the first chosen apostle, was designated chairman and director general of the 12. 2. Peter, James, and John were appointed personal companions of Jesus. They were to attend him day and night, to minister to his physical and sundry needs, and to accompany him on those night vigils of prayer and mysterious communion with the Father in heaven. 3. Philip was made steward of the group. It was his duty to provide food and to see that visitors and even the multitude of listeners at times had something to eat. 4. Nathanael watched over the needs of the families of the 12. He received regular reports as to the requirements of each apostle's family and, making requisition on Judas, the treasurer, would send funds each week to those in need. 5. Matthew was the fiscal agent of the apostolic corps. It was his duty to see that the budget was balanced, the treasury replenished. If the funds for mutual support were not forthcoming, if donations sufficient to maintain the party were not received, Matthew was empowered to order the 12 back to their nets for a season. But this was never necessary after they began their public work. He always had sufficient funds in the treasurer's hands to finance their activities. 6. Thomas was manager of the itinerary. It devolved upon him to arrange lodgings and in a general way select places for teaching and preaching, thereby ensuring a smooth and expeditious travel schedule. 7. James and Judas, the twin sons of Alphaeus, were assigned to the management of the multitudes. It was their task to deputize a sufficient number of assistant ushers to enable them to maintain order among the crowds during the preaching. 8. Simon Zelotes was given charge of recreation and play. He managed the Wednesday programs and also sought to provide for a few hours of relaxation and diversion each day. 9. Judas Iscariot was appointed treasurer. He carried the bag. He paid all expenses and kept the books. He made budget estimates for Matthew from week to week and also made weekly reports to Andrew. Judas paid out funds on Andrew's authorization. In this way, the 12 functioned from their early organization up to the time of the reorganization made necessary by the desertion of Judas, the betrayer. The Master and his disciple apostles went on in this simple manner until Sunday, January 12, AD 27, when he called them together and formally ordained them as ambassadors of the kingdom and preachers of its glad tidings. And soon thereafter they prepared to start for Jerusalem and Judea on their first public preaching tour.
Paper 139. The 12 Apostles. It is an eloquent testimony to the charm and righteousness of Jesus' earth life that, although he repeatedly dashed to pieces the hopes of his apostles and tore to shreds their every ambition for personal exaltation, only one deserted him. The apostles learned from Jesus about the kingdom of heaven, and Jesus learned much from them about the kingdom of men, human nature as it lives on Urantia and on the other evolutionary worlds of time and space. These 12 men represented many different types of human temperament, and they had not been made alike by schooling. Many of these Galilean fishermen carried heavy strains of Gentile blood as a result of the forcible conversion of the Gentile population of Galilee 100 years previously. Do not make the mistake of regarding the apostles as being altogether ignorant and unlearned. All of them, except the Alphaeus twins, were graduates of the synagogue schools, having been thoroughly trained in the Hebrew Scriptures and in much of the current knowledge of that day. 7 were graduates of the Capernaum synagogue schools, and there were no better Jewish schools in all Galilee. When your records refer to these messengers of the kingdom as being ignorant and unlearned, it was intended to convey the idea that they were laymen, unlearned in the lore of the rabbis, and untrained in the methods of rabbinical interpretation of the Scriptures. They were lacking in so-called higher education. In modern times, they would certainly be considered uneducated and, in some circles of society, even uncultured. One thing is certain. They had not all been put through the same rigid and stereotyped educational curriculum. From adolescence on, they had enjoyed separate experiences of learning how to live. 1. Andrew, the first chosen. Andrew, chairman of the apostolic corps of the kingdom, was born in Capernaum. He was the oldest child in a family of 5, himself, his brother Simon, and 3 sisters. His father, now dead, had been a partner of Zebedee in the fish-drying business at Bethsaida, the fishing harbor of Capernaum. When he became an apostle, Andrew was unmarried, but made his home with his married brother Simon Peter. Both were fishermen and partners of James and John, the sons of Zebedee. In A.D. 26, the year he was chosen as an apostle, Andrew was 33, a full year older than Jesus, and the oldest of the apostles. He sprang from an excellent line of ancestors, and was the ablest man of the 12. Excepting oratory, he was the peer of his associates in almost every imaginable ability. Jesus never gave Andrew a nickname, a fraternal designation. But even as the apostles soon began to call Jesus Master, they also designated Andrew by a term the equivalent of chief. Andrew was a good organizer, but a better administrator. He was one of the inner circle of 4 apostles, but his appointment by Jesus as the head of the apostolic group made it necessary for him to remain on duty with his brethren, while the other 3 enjoyed very close communion with the Master. To the very end, Andrew remained dean of the apostolic corps. Although Andrew was never an effective preacher, he was an efficient personal worker, being the pioneer missionary of the kingdom, in that, as the first chosen apostle, he immediately brought to Jesus his brother Simon, who subsequently became one of the greatest preachers of the kingdom. Andrew was the chief supporter of Jesus' policy of utilizing the program of personal work as a means of training the 12 as messengers of the kingdom. Whether Jesus privately taught the apostles or preached to the multitude, Andrew was usually conversant with what was going on. He was an understanding executive and an efficient administrator. He rendered a prompt decision on every matter brought to his notice, unless he deemed the problem one beyond the domain of his authority, in which event he would take it straight to Jesus. Andrew and Peter were very unlike in character and temperament, but it must be recorded everlastingly to their credit that they got along together splendidly. Andrew was never jealous of Peter's oratorical ability. Not often will an older man of Andrew's type be observed exerting such a profound influence over a younger and talented brother. Andrew and Peter never seemed to be in the least jealous of each other's abilities or achievements. Late on the evening of the day of Pentecost, when largely through the energetic and inspiring preaching of Peter 2,000 souls were added to the kingdom, Andrew said to his brother, "I could not do that, but I am glad I have a brother who could." To which Peter replied, "And but for your bringing me to the Master, and by your steadfastness keeping me with him, I should not have been here to do this." Andrew and Peter were the exceptions to the rule, proving that even brothers can live together peaceably and work together effectively. After Pentecost, Peter was famous. but it never irritated the older Andrew to spend the rest of his life being introduced as Simon Peter's brother. Of all the apostles, Andrew was the best judge of men. He knew that trouble was brewing in the heart of Judas Iscariot, even when none of the others suspected that anything was wrong with their treasurer. But he told none of them his fears. Andrew's great service to the kingdom was in advising Peter, James, and John concerning the choice of the first missionaries who were set out to proclaim the gospel, and also in counseling these early leaders about the organization of the administrative affairs of the kingdom. Andrew had a great gift for discovering the hidden resources and latent talents of young people. Very soon after Jesus' ascension on high, Andrew began the writing of a personal record of many of the sayings and doings of his departed master. After Andrew's death, other copies of this private record were made and circulated freely among the early teachers of the Christian Church. These informal notes of Andrew's were subsequently edited, amended, altered, and added to until they made up a fairly consecutive narrative of the Master's life on earth. The last of these few altered and amended copies was destroyed by fire at Alexandria about 100 years after the original was written by the first chosen of the 12 apostles. Andrew was a man of clear insight, logical thought, and firm decision, whose great strength of character consisted in his superb stability. His temperamental handicap was his lack of enthusiasm. He many times failed to encourage his associates by judicious commendation, and this reticence to praise the worthy accomplishments of his friends grew out of his abhorrence of flattery and insincerity. Andrew was one of those all-round, even-tempered, self-made, and successful men of modest affairs. Every one of the apostles loved Jesus, but it remains true that each of the 12 was drawn toward him because of some certain trait of personality which made a special appeal to the individual apostle. Andrew admired Jesus because of his consistent sincerity, his unaffected dignity. When men once knew Jesus, they were possessed with the urge to share him with their friends. They really wanted all the world to know him. When the later persecutions finally scattered the apostles from Jerusalem, Andrew journeyed through Armenia, Asia Minor, and Macedonia, and after bringing many thousands into the kingdom, was finally apprehended and crucified in Patria in Achaia. It was 2 full days before this robust man expired on the cross, and throughout these tragic hours he continued effectively to proclaim the glad tidings of the salvation of the kingdom of heaven. 2. Simon Peter. When Simon joined the apostles, he was 30 years of age. He was married, had 3 children, and lived at Bethsaida near Capernaum. His brother Andrew and his wife's mother lived with him. Both Peter and Andrew were fisher partners of the sons of Zebedee. The Master had known Simon for some time before Andrew presented him as the second of the apostles. When Jesus gave Simon the name Peter, he did it with a smile. It was to be a sort of nickname. Simon was well known to all his friends as an erratic and impulsive fellow. True, later on, Jesus did attach a new and significant import to this lightly bestowed nickname. Simon Peter was a man of impulse, an optimist. He had grown up permitting himself freely to indulge strong feelings. He was constantly getting into difficulties because he persisted in speaking without thinking. This sort of thoughtlessness also made incessant trouble for all of his friends and associates, and was the cause of his receiving many mild rebukes from his master. The only reason Peter did not get into more trouble because of his thoughtless speaking was that he very early learned to talk over many of his plans and schemes with his brother Andrew before he ventured to make public proposals. Peter was a fluent speaker, eloquent and dramatic. He was also a natural and inspirational leader of men, a quick thinker but not a deep reasoner. He asked many questions, more than all the apostles put together, and while the majority of these questions were good and relevant, Many of them were thoughtless and foolish. Peter did not have a deep mind, but he knew his mind fairly well. He was, therefore, a man of quick decision and sudden action. While others talked in their astonishment at seeing Jesus on the beach, Peter jumped in and swam ashore to meet the Master. The one trait which Peter most admired in Jesus was his supernal tenderness. Peter never grew weary of contemplating Jesus' forbearance. He never forgot the lesson about forgiving the wrongdoer, not only 7 times, but 70 times and 7. He thought much about these impressions of the Master's forgiving character during those dark and dismal days immediately following his thoughtless and unintended denial of Jesus in the high priest's courtyard. Simon Peter was distressingly vacillating. He would suddenly swing from one extreme to the other. First he refused to let Jesus wash his feet, and then, on hearing the Master's reply, begged to be washed all over. But after all, Jesus knew that Peter's faults were of the head and not of the heart. He was one of the most inexplicable combinations of courage and cowardice that ever lived on earth. His great strength of character was loyalty, friendship. Peter really and truly loved Jesus. And yet, despite this towering strength of devotion, he was so unstable and inconstant that he permitted a servant girl to tease him into denying his Lord and Master. Peter could withstand persecution and any other form of direct assault, but he withered and shrank before ridicule. He was a brave soldier when facing a frontal attack, but he was a fear-cringing coward when surprised with an assault from the rear. Peter was the first of Jesus' apostles to come forward to defend the work of Philip among the Samaritans and Paul among the Gentiles. Yet later on at Antioch, he reversed himself when confronted by ridiculing Judaizers, temporarily withdrawing from the Gentiles only to bring down upon his head the fearless denunciation of Paul. He was the first one of the apostles to make wholehearted confession of Jesus' combined humanity and divinity, and the first, save Judas, to deny him. Peter was not so much of a dreamer, but he disliked to descend from the clouds of ecstasy and the enthusiasm of dramatic indulgence to the plain and matter-of-fact world of reality. In following Jesus, literally and figuratively, he was either leading the procession or else trailing behind, following afar off. But he was the outstanding preacher of the 12. He did more than any other one man aside from Paul to establish the kingdom and send its messengers to the 4 corners of the earth in one generation. After his rash denials of the Master, he found himself, and with Andrew's sympathetic and understanding guidance, he again led the way back to the fish nets while the apostles tarried to find out what was to happen after the crucifixion. When he was fully assured that Jesus had forgiven him and knew he had been received back into the Master's fold, the fires of the kingdom burned so brightly within his soul that he became a great and saving light to thousands who sat in darkness. After leaving Jerusalem, and before Paul became the leading spirit among the Gentile Christian churches, Peter traveled extensively, visiting all the churches from Babylon to Corinth. He even visited and ministered to many of the churches which had been raised up by Paul. Although Peter and Paul differed much in temperament and education, even in theology, they worked together harmoniously for the upbuilding of the churches during their later years. Something of Peter's style in teaching is shown in the sermons partially recorded by Luke and in the Gospel of Mark. His vigorous style was better shown in his letter known as the First Epistle of Peter. At least this was true before it was subsequently altered by a disciple of Paul. But Peter persisted in making the mistake of trying to convince the Jews that Jesus was, after all, really and truly the Jewish Messiah. Right up to the day of his death, Simon Peter continued to suffer confusion in his mind between the concepts of Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, Christ as the world's Redeemer, and the Son of Man as the revelation of God, the loving Father of all mankind. Peter's wife was a very able woman. For years she labored acceptably as a member of the women's corps, and when Peter was driven out of Jerusalem, she accompanied him upon all his journeys to the churches as well as on all his missionary excursions. And the day her illustrious husband yielded up his life, she was thrown to the wild beasts in the arena at Rome. And so this man Peter, an intimate of Jesus, one of the inner circle, went forth from Jerusalem proclaiming the glad tidings of the kingdom with power and glory until the fullness of his ministry had been accomplished. And he regarded himself as the recipient of high honors when his captors informed him that he must die as his master had died, on the cross. And thus was Simon Peter crucified in Rome. 3. James Zebedee. James, the older of the two apostle sons of Zebedee, whom Jesus nicknamed Sons of Thunder, was 30 years old when he became an apostle. He was married, had 4 children, and lived near his parents in the outskirts of Capernaum, Bethsaida. He was a fisherman, plying his calling in company with his younger brother John and in association with Andrew and Simon. James and his brother John enjoyed the advantage of having known Jesus longer than any of the other apostles. This able apostle was a temperamental contradiction. He seemed really to possess 2 natures, both of which were actuated by strong feelings. He was particularly vehement when his indignation was once fully aroused. He had a fiery temper when once it was adequately provoked, and when the storm was over, he was always wont to justify and excuse his anger under the pretense that it was wholly a manifestation of righteous indignation. Except for these periodic upheavals of wrath, James's personality was much like that of Andrew. He did not have Andrew's discretion or insight into human nature, but he was a much better public speaker. Next to Peter, unless it was Matthew, James was the best public orator among the 12. Though James was in no sense moody, he could be quiet and taciturn one day and a very good talker and storyteller the next. He usually talked freely with Jesus, but among the 12, for days at a time, he was the silent man. His one great weakness was these spells of unaccountable silence. The outstanding feature of James's personality was his ability to see all sides of a proposition. Of all the 12, he came the nearest to grasping the real import and significance of Jesus' teaching. He, too, was slow at first to comprehend the Master's meaning, but ere they had finished their training, he had acquired a superior concept of Jesus' message. James was able to understand a wide range of human nature. He got along well with the versatile Andrew, the impetuous Peter, and his self-contained brother John. Though James and John had their troubles trying to work together, it was inspiring to observe how well they got along. They did not succeed quite so well as Andrew and Peter, but they did much better than would ordinarily be expected of 2 brothers, especially such headstrong and determined brothers. But, strange as it may seem, these 2 sons of Zebedee were much more tolerant of each other than they were of strangers. They had a great affection for one another. They had always been happy playmates. It was these sons of thunder who wanted to call fire down from heaven to destroy the Samaritans who presumed to show disrespect for their master. But the untimely death of James greatly modified the vehement temperament of his younger brother John. That characteristic of Jesus which James most admired was the Master's sympathetic affection. Jesus' understanding interest in the small and the great, the rich and the poor, made a great appeal to him. James Zebedee was a well-balanced thinker and planner. Along with Andrew, he was one of the more level-headed of the apostolic group. He was a vigorous individual, but was never in a hurry. He was an excellent balance wheel for Peter. He was modest and undramatic, a daily server, an unpretentious worker, seeking no special reward when he once grasped something of the real meaning of the kingdom. And even in the story about the mother of James and John, who asked that her sons be granted places on the right hand and the left hand of Jesus, it should be remembered that it was the mother who made this request. And when they signified that they were ready to assume such responsibilities, it should be recognized that they were cognizant of the dangers accompanying the Master's supposed revolt against the Roman power, and that they were also willing to pay the price. When Jesus asked if they were ready to drink the cup, they replied that they were. And as concerns James, it was literally true. He did drink the cup with the Master, seeing that he was the first of the apostles to experience martyrdom, being early put to death with the sword by Herod Agrippa. James was thus the first of the 12 to sacrifice his life upon the new battle line of the kingdom. Herod Agrippa feared James above all the other apostles. He was indeed often quiet and silent, but he was brave and determined when his convictions were aroused and challenged. James lived his life to the full, and when the end came, he bore himself with such grace and fortitude that even his accuser and informer, who attended his trial and execution, was so touched that he rushed away from the scene of James's death to join himself to the disciples of Jesus. 4. John Zebedee. When he became an apostle, John was 24 years old and was the youngest of the 12. He was unmarried and lived with his parents at Bethsaida. He was a fisherman and worked with his brother James in partnership with Andrew and Peter. Both before and after becoming an apostle, John functioned as the personal agent of Jesus in dealing with the Master's family, and he continued to bear this responsibility as long as Mary, the mother of Jesus, lived. Since John was the youngest of the 12, and so closely associated with Jesus in his family affairs, he was very dear to the Master. But it cannot be truthfully said that he was the disciple whom Jesus loved. You would hardly suspect such a magnanimous personality as Jesus to be guilty of showing favoritism, of loving one of his apostles more than the others. The fact that John was one of the 3 personal aides of Jesus lent further color to this mistaken idea, not to mention that John, along with his brother James, had known Jesus longer than the others. Peter, James, and John were assigned as personal aides to Jesus soon after they became apostles. Shortly after the selection of the 12, and at the time Jesus appointed Andrew to act as director of the group, he said to him, "And now I desire that you assign 2 or 3 of your associates to be with me, and to remain by my side, to comfort me, and to minister to my daily needs." And Andrew thought best to select for this special duty the next 3 first-chosen apostles. He would have liked to volunteer for such a blessed service himself, but the Master had already given him his commission, so he immediately directed that Peter, James, and John attach themselves to Jesus. John Zebedee had many lovely traits of character, but one which was not so lovely was his inordinate but usually well-concealed conceit. His long association with Jesus made many and great changes in his character. This conceit was greatly lessened, but after growing old and becoming more or less childish, this self-esteem reappeared to a certain extent, so that, when engaged in directing Nathan in the writing of the gospel which now bears his name, the aged apostle did not hesitate repeatedly to refer to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. In view of the fact that John came nearer to being the chum of Jesus than any other earth mortal, that he was his chosen personal representative in so many matters, it is not strange that he should have come to regard himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved, since he most certainly knew he was the disciple whom Jesus so frequently trusted. The strongest trait in John's character was his dependability. He was prompt and courageous, faithful and devoted. His greatest weakness was this characteristic conceit. He was the youngest member of his father's family, and the youngest of the apostolic group. Perhaps he was just a bit spoiled. Maybe he had been humored slightly too much. But the John of after years was a very different type of person than the self-admiring and arbitrary young man who joined the ranks of Jesus' apostles when he was 24. Those characteristics of Jesus which John most appreciated were the Master's love and unselfishness. These traits made such an impression on him that his whole subsequent life became dominated by the sentiment of love and brotherly devotion. He talked about love and wrote about love. This Son of Thunder became the Apostle of Love. And at Ephesus, when the aged bishop was no longer able to stand in the pulpit and preach, but had to be carried to church in a chair, and when at the close of the service he was asked to say a few words to the believers, for years his only utterance was, "My little children, love one another." John was a man of few words, except when his temper was aroused. He thought much, but said little. As he grew older, his temper became more subdued, better controlled, but he never overcame his disinclination to talk. He never fully mastered this reticence. But he was gifted with a remarkable and creative imagination. There was another side to John that one would not expect to find in this quiet and introspective type. He was somewhat bigoted and inordinately intolerant. In this respect, he and James were much alike. They both wanted to call down fire from heaven on the heads of the disrespectful Samaritans. When John encountered some strangers teaching in Jesus' name, he promptly forbade them. But he was not the only one of the 12 who was tainted with this kind of self-esteem and superiority consciousness. John's life was tremendously influenced by the sight of Jesus going about without a home, as he knew how faithfully he had made provision for the care of his mother and family. John also deeply sympathized with Jesus because of his family's failure to understand him, being aware that they were gradually withdrawing from him. This entire situation, together with Jesus ever deferring his slightest wish to the will of the Father in heaven, and his daily life of implicit trust, made such a profound impression on John that it produced marked and permanent changes in his character, changes which manifested themselves throughout his entire subsequent life. John had a cool and daring courage which few of the other apostles possessed. He was the one apostle who followed right along with Jesus the night of his arrest and dared to accompany his master into the very jaws of death. He was present and near at hand right up to the last earthly hour, and was found faithfully carrying out his trust with regard to Jesus' mother, and ready to receive such additional instructions as might be given during the last moments of the Master's mortal existence. One thing is certain: John was thoroughly dependable. John usually sat on Jesus' right hand when the 12 were at meat. He was the first of the 12 really and fully to believe in the resurrection, and he was the first to recognize the Master when he came to them on the seashore after his resurrection. This son of Zebedee was very closely associated with Peter in the early activities of the Christian movement, becoming one of the chief supporters of the Jerusalem church. He was the right-hand support of Peter on the day of Pentecost. Several years after the martyrdom of James, John married his brother's widow. The last 20 years of his life, he was cared for by a loving granddaughter. John was in prison several times and was banished to the Isle of Patmos for a period of 4 years until another emperor came to power in Rome. Had not John been tactful and sagacious, he would undoubtedly have been killed, as was his more outspoken brother James. As the years passed, John, together with James, the Lord's brother, learned to practice wise conciliation when they appeared before the civil magistrates. They found that a soft answer turns away wrath. They also learned to represent the church as a spiritual brotherhood devoted to the social service of mankind, rather than as the kingdom of heaven. They taught loving service rather than ruling power, kingdom and king. When in temporary exile on Patmos, John wrote the book of Revelation, which you now have in greatly abridged and distorted form. This book of Revelation contains the surviving fragments of a great revelation, large portions of which were lost, other portions of which were removed subsequent to John's writing. It is preserved in only fragmentary and adulterated form. John traveled much, labored incessantly, and after becoming bishop of the Asia churches, settled down at Ephesus. He directed his associate Nathan in the writing of the so-called Gospel according to John at Ephesus when he was 99 years old. Of all the 12 apostles, John Zebedee eventually became the outstanding theologian. He died a natural death at Ephesus in A.D. 103, when he was 101 years of age. 5. Philip the Curious. Philip was the 5th apostle to be chosen, being called when Jesus and his first 4 apostles were on their way from John's rendezvous on the Jordan to Cana of Galilee. Since he lived at Bethsaida, Philip had for some time known of Jesus, but it had not occurred to him that Jesus was a really great man until that day in the Jordan Valley when he said, "Follow me." Philip was also somewhat influenced by the fact that Andrew, Peter, James, and John had accepted Jesus as the deliverer. Philip was 27 years of age when he joined the apostles. He had recently been married, but he had no children at this time. The nickname which the apostles gave him signified curiosity. Philip was always wanting to be shown. He never seemed to see very far into any proposition. He was not necessarily dull, but he lacked imagination. This lack of imagination was the great weakness of his character. He was a commonplace and matter-of-fact individual. When the apostles were organized for service, Philip was made steward. It was his duty to see that they were at all times supplied with provisions, and he was a good steward. His strongest characteristic was his methodical thoroughness. He was both mathematical and systematic. Philip came from a family of 7, 3 boys and 4 girls. He was next to the oldest, and after the resurrection, he baptized his entire family into the kingdom. Philip's people were fisher folk. His father was a very able man, a deep thinker, but his mother was of a very mediocre family. Philip was not a man who could be expected to do big things. But he was a man who could do little things in a big way, do them well and acceptably. Only a few times in 4 years did he fail to have food on hand to satisfy the needs of all. Even the many emergency demands attendant upon the life they lived seldom found him unprepared. The commissary department of the apostolic family was intelligently and efficiently managed. The strong point about Philip was his methodical reliability. The weak point in his makeup was his utter lack of imagination, the absence of the ability to put 2 and 2 together to obtain 4. He was mathematical in the abstract, but not constructive in his imagination. He was almost entirely lacking in certain types of imagination. He was the typical, everyday and commonplace, average man. There were a great many such men and women among the multitudes who came to hear Jesus teach and preach, and they derived great comfort from observing one like themselves, elevated to an honored position in the councils of the Master. They derived courage from the fact that one like themselves had already found a high place in the affairs of the kingdom. And Jesus learned much about the way some human minds function as he so patiently listened to Philip's foolish questions and so many times complied with his steward's request to be shown. The one quality about Jesus which Philip so continuously admired was the Master's unfailing generosity. Never could Philip find anything in Jesus which was small, niggardly, or stingy, and he worshipped this ever-present and unfailing liberality. There was little about Philip's personality that was impressive. He was often spoken of as Philip of Bethsaida, the town where Andrew and Peter live. He was almost without discerning vision. He was unable to grasp the dramatic possibilities of a given situation. He was not pessimistic. He was simply prosaic. He was also greatly lacking in spiritual insight. He would not hesitate to interrupt Jesus in the midst of one of the Master's most profound discourses to ask an apparently foolish question. But Jesus never reprimanded him for such thoughtlessness. He was patient with him and considerate of his inability to grasp the deeper meanings of the teaching. Jesus well knew that if he once rebuked Philip for asking these annoying questions, he would not only wound this honest soul, but such a reprimand would so hurt Philip that he would never again feel free to ask questions. Jesus knew that on his worlds of space there were untold billions of similar slow-thinking mortals, and he wanted to encourage them all to look to him and always feel free to come to him with their questions and problems. After all, Jesus was really more interested in Philip's foolish questions than in the sermon he might be preaching. Jesus was supremely interested in men, all kinds of men. The apostolic steward was not a good public speaker, but he was a very persuasive and successful personal worker. He was not easily discouraged. He was a plodder and very tenacious in anything he undertook. He had that great and rare gift of saying, "Come." When his first convert, Nathanael, wanted to argue about the merits and demerits of Jesus and Nazareth, Philip's effective reply was, "Come and see." He was not a dogmatic preacher who exhorted his hearers to go, do this, and do that. He met all situations as they arose in his work with "Come. Come with me. I will show you the way." And that is always the effective technique in all forms and phases of teaching. Even parents may learn from Philip the better way of saying to their children, not "go do this and go do that," but rather, "Come with us while we show and share with you the better way." The inability of Philip to adapt himself to a new situation was well shown when the Greeks came to him at Jerusalem saying, "Sir, we desire to see Jesus." Now Philip would have said to any Jew asking such a question, "Come." But these men were foreigners, and Philip could remember no instructions from his superiors regarding such matters. So the only thing he could think to do was to consult the chief Andrew, and then they both escorted the inquiring Greeks to Jesus. Likewise, when he went into Samaria preaching and baptizing believers as he had been instructed by his master, he refrained from laying hands on his converts in token of their having received the Spirit of truth. This was done by Peter and John, who presently came down from Jerusalem to observe his work in behalf of the Mother Church. Philip went on through the trying times of the Master's death, participated in the reorganization of the 12, and was the first to go forth to win souls for the kingdom outside of the immediate Jewish ranks, being most successful in his work for the Samaritans and in all his subsequent labors in behalf of the gospel. Philip's wife, who was an efficient member of the Women's Corps, became actively associated with her husband in his evangelistic work after their flight from the Jerusalem persecutions. His wife was a fearless woman. She stood at the foot of Philip's cross encouraging him to proclaim the glad tidings even to his murderers, and when his strength failed, she began the recital of the story of salvation by faith in Jesus, and was silenced only when the irate Jews rushed upon her and stoned her to death. Their eldest daughter, Leah, continued their work, later on becoming the renowned prophetess of Hierapolis. Philip, the one-time steward of the 12, was a mighty man in the kingdom, winning souls wherever he went, and he was finally crucified for his faith and buried at Hierapolis. 6. Honest Nathanael. Nathanael, the sixth and last of the apostles to be chosen by the Master himself, was brought to Jesus by his friend Philip. He had been associated in several business enterprises with Philip, and with him was on the way down to see John the Baptist when they encountered Jesus. When Nathanael joined the apostles, he was 25 years old and was next to the youngest of the group. He was the youngest of a family of 7, was unmarried, and the only support of aged and infirm parents with whom he lived at Cana. His brothers and sister were either married or deceased, and none lived there. Nathanael and Judas Iscariot were the 2 best-educated men among the 12. Nathanael had thought to become a merchant. Jesus did not himself give Nathanael a nickname, but the 12 soon began to speak of him in terms that signified honesty, sincerity. He was without guile, and this was his great virtue. He was both honest and sincere. The weakness of his character was his pride. He was very proud of his family, his city, his reputation, and his nation, all of which is commendable if it is not carried too far. But Nathanael was inclined to go to extremes with his personal prejudices. He was disposed to prejudge individuals in accordance with his personal opinions. He was not slow to ask the question, even before he had met Jesus, "Can any good thing come out of Nazareth?" But Nathanael was not obstinate, even if he was proud. He was quick to reverse himself when he once looked into Jesus' face. In many respects, Nathanael was the odd genius of the 12. He was the apostolic philosopher and dreamer, but he was a very practical sort of dreamer. He alternated between seasons of profound philosophy and periods of rare and droll humor. When in the proper mood, he was probably the best storyteller among the 12. Jesus greatly enjoyed hearing Nathanael discourse on things both serious and frivolous. Nathanael progressively took Jesus and the kingdom more seriously, but never did he take himself seriously. The apostles all loved and respected Nathanael, and he got along with them splendidly, excepting Judas Iscariot. Judas did not think Nathanael took his apostleship sufficiently seriously, and once had the temerity to go secretly to Jesus and lodge complaint against him. Said Jesus, "Judas, watch carefully your steps. Do not over-magnify your office. Who of us is competent to judge his brother? It is not the Father's will that his children should partake only of the serious things of life. Let me repeat, I have come that my brethren in the flesh may have joy, gladness, and life more abundantly. Go then, Judas, and do well that which has been entrusted to you, but leave Nathanael your brother to give account of himself to God." And the memory of this, with that of many similar experiences, long lived in the self-deceiving heart of Judas Iscariot. Many times when Jesus was away on the mountain with Peter, James, and John, and things were becoming tense and tangled among the apostles, when even Andrew was in doubt about what to say to his disconsolate brethren, Nathanael would relieve the tension by a bit of philosophy or a flash of humor. Good humor, too. Nathanael's duty was to look after the families of the 12. He was often absent from the apostolic councils, for when he heard that sickness or anything out of the ordinary had happened to one of his charges, he lost no time in getting to that home. The 12 rested securely in the knowledge that their family's welfare was safe in the hands of Nathanael. Nathanael most revered Jesus for his tolerance. He never grew weary of contemplating the broad-mindedness and generous sympathy of the Son of Man. Nathanael's father, Bartholomew, died shortly after Pentecost, after which this apostle went into Mesopotamia and India, proclaiming the glad tidings of the kingdom and baptizing believers. His brethren never knew what became of their one-time philosopher, poet, and humorist. But he also was a great man in the kingdom, and did much to spread his master's teachings, even though he did not participate in the organization of the subsequent Christian church. Nathanael died in India. 7. Matthew, Levi. Matthew, the 7th apostle, was chosen by Andrew. Matthew belonged to a family of tax-gatherers, or publicans, but was himself a customs collector in Capernaum where he lived. He was 31 years old and married and had 4 children. He was a man of moderate wealth, the only one of any means belonging to the apostolic corps. He was a good businessman, a good social mixer, and was gifted with the ability to make friends and to get along smoothly with a great variety of people. Andrew appointed Matthew the financial representative of the apostles. In a way, he was the fiscal agent and publicity spokesman for the apostolic organization. He was a keen judge of human nature and a very efficient propagandist. His is a personality difficult to visualize, but he was a very earnest disciple and an increasing believer in the mission of Jesus and in the certainty of the kingdom. Jesus never gave Levi a nickname, but his fellow apostles commonly referred to him as the money-getter. Levi's strong point was his whole-hearted devotion to the cause. That he, a publican, had been taken in by Jesus and his apostles was the cause for overwhelming gratitude on the part of the former revenue collector. However, it required some little time for the rest of the apostles, especially Simon Zelotes and Judas Iscariot, to become reconciled to the publican's presence in their midst. Matthew's weakness was his short-sighted and materialistic viewpoint of life. But in all these matters he made great progress as the months went by. He, of course, had to be absent from many of the most precious seasons of instruction, as it was his duty to keep the treasury replenished. It was the Master's forgiving disposition which Matthew most appreciated. He would never cease to recount that faith only was necessary in the business of finding God. He always liked to speak of the kingdom as this business of finding God. Though Matthew was a man with a past, he gave an excellent account of himself, and as time went on, his associates became proud of the publican's performances. He was one of the apostles who made extensive notes on the sayings of Jesus, and these notes were used as the basis of Isidore's subsequent narrative of the sayings and doings of Jesus, which has become known as the Gospel according to Matthew. The great and useful life of Matthew, the businessman and customs collector of Capernaum, has been the means of leading thousands upon thousands of other businessmen, public officials, and politicians down through the subsequent ages, also to hear that engaging voice of the Master saying, "Follow me." Matthew really was a shrewd politician, but he was intensely loyal to Jesus and supremely devoted to the task of seeing that the messengers of the coming kingdom were adequately financed. The presence of Matthew among the 12 was the means of keeping the doors of the kingdom wide open to hosts of downhearted and outcast souls who had regarded themselves as long since without the bounds of religious consolation. Outcast and despairing men and women flocked to hear Jesus, and he never turned one away. Matthew received freely tendered offerings from believing disciples and the immediate auditors of the Master's teachings, but he never openly solicited funds from the multitudes. He did all his financial work in a quiet and personal way, and raised most of the money among the more substantial class of interested believers. He gave practically the whole of his modest fortune to the work of the Master and his apostles. But they never knew of this generosity save Jesus, who knew all about it. Matthew hesitated openly to contribute to the apostolic funds for fear that Jesus and his associates might regard his money as being tainted. So he gave much in the names of other believers. During the earlier months, when Matthew knew his presence among them was more or less of a trial, he was strongly tempted to let them know that his funds often supplied them with their daily bread, but he did not yield. When evidence of the disdain of the publican would become manifest, Levi would burn to reveal to them his generosity, but always he managed to keep still. When the funds for the week were short of the estimated requirements, Levi would often draw heavily upon his own personal resources. Also, sometimes when he became greatly interested in Jesus' teaching, He preferred to remain and hear the instruction, even though he knew he must personally make up for his failure to solicit the necessary funds. But Levi did so wish that Jesus might know that much of the money came from his pocket. He little realized that the Master knew all about it. The apostles all died without knowing that Matthew was their benefactor to such an extent that, when he went forth to proclaim the gospel of the kingdom after the beginning of the persecutions, he was practically penniless. When these persecutions caused the believers to forsake Jerusalem, Matthew journeyed north, preaching the gospel of the kingdom and baptizing believers. He was lost to the knowledge of his former apostolic associates, but on he went preaching and baptizing through Syria, Cappadocia, Galatia, Bithynia, and Thrace. And it was in Thrace, at Lysimachia, that certain unbelieving Jews conspired with the Roman soldiers to encompass his death. And this regenerated publican died triumphant in the faith of a salvation he had so surely learned from the teachings of the Master during his recent sojourn on earth. 8. Thomas Didymus. Thomas was the 8th apostle, and he was chosen by Philip. In later times he has become known as Doubting Thomas, but his fellow apostles hardly looked upon him as a chronic doubter. True, his was a logical, skeptical type of mind, but he had a form of courageous loyalty which forbade those who knew him intimately to regard him as a trifling skeptic. When Thomas joined the apostles, he was 29 years old, was married, and had 4 children. Formerly he had been a carpenter and stonemason, but latterly he had become a fisherman and resided at Tarichea, situated on the west bank of the Jordan, where it flows out of the Sea of Galilee, and he was regarded as the leading citizen of this little village. He had little education, but he possessed a keen, reasoning mind, and was the son of excellent parents who lived at Tiberias. Thomas had the one truly analytical mind of the 12. He was the real scientist of the apostolic group. The early home life of Thomas had been unfortunate. His parents were not altogether happy in their married life, and this was reflected in Thomas's adult experience. He grew up having a very disagreeable and quarrelsome disposition. Even his wife was glad to see him join the apostles. She was relieved by the thought that her pessimistic husband would be away from home most of the time. Thomas also had a streak of suspicion, which made it very difficult to get along peaceably with him. Peter was very much upset by Thomas at first, complaining to his brother Andrew that Thomas was mean, ugly, and always suspicious. But the better his associates knew Thomas, the more they liked him. They found he was superbly honest and unflinchingly loyal. He was perfectly sincere and unquestionably truthful. But he was a natural-born fault-finder and had grown up to become a real pessimist. His analytical mind had become cursed with suspicion. He was rapidly losing faith in his fellow men when he became associated with the 12 and thus came in contact with the noble character of Jesus. This association with the Master began at once to transform Thomas's whole disposition and to effect great changes in his mental reactions to his fellow men. Thomas's great strength was his superb analytical mind coupled with his unflinching courage when he had once made up his mind. His great weakness was his suspicious doubting, which he never fully overcame throughout his whole lifetime in the flesh. In the organization of the 12, Thomas was assigned to arrange and manage the itinerary, and he was an able director of the work and movements of the apostolic corps. He was a good executive, an excellent businessman, but he was handicapped by his many moods. He was one man one day and another man the next. He was inclined toward melancholic brooding when he joined the apostles, but contact with Jesus and the apostles largely cured him of this morbid introspection. Jesus enjoyed Thomas very much and had many long personal talks with him. His presence among the apostles was a great comfort to all honest doubters, and encouraged many troubled minds to come into the kingdom, even if they could not wholly understand everything about the spiritual and philosophic phases of the teachings of Jesus. Thomas's membership in the 12 was a standing declaration that Jesus loved even honest doubters. The other apostles held Jesus in reverence because of some special and outstanding trait of his replete personality. But Thomas revered his master because of his superbly balanced character. Increasingly, Thomas admired and honored one who was so lovingly merciful, yet so inflexibly just and fair, so firm, but never obstinate, so calm, but never indifferent, so helpful and so sympathetic, but never meddlesome or dictatorial, so strong, but at the same time so gentle, so positive, but never rough or rude, so tender but never vacillating, so pure and innocent, but at the same time so virile, aggressive, and forceful, so truly courageous, but never rash or foolhardy, such a lover of nature, but so free from all tendency to revere nature, so humorous and so playful, but so free from levity and frivolity. It was this matchless symmetry of personality that so charmed Thomas. He probably enjoyed the highest intellectual understanding and personality appreciation of Jesus of any of the 12. In the councils of the 12, Thomas was always cautious, advocating a policy of safety first. But if his conservatism was voted down or overruled, he was always the first fearlessly to move out in execution of the program decided upon. Again and again would he stand out against some project as being foolhardy and presumptuous. He would debate to the bitter end. But when Andrew would put the proposition to a vote, and after the 12 would elect to do that which he had so strenuously opposed, Thomas was the first to say, "Let's go." He was a good loser. He did not hold grudges nor nurse wounded feelings. Time and again did he oppose letting Jesus expose himself to danger. But when the Master would decide to take such risks, always was it Thomas who rallied the apostles with his courageous words, "Come on, comrades, let's go and die with him." Thomas was in some respects like Philip. He also wanted to be shown, but his outward expressions of doubt were based on entirely different intellectual operations. Thomas was analytical, not merely skeptical. As far as personal physical courage was concerned, he was one of the bravest among the 12. Thomas had some very bad days. He was blue and downcast at times. The loss of his twin sister when he was 9 years old had occasioned him much youthful sorrow, and had added to his temperamental problems of later life. When Thomas would become despondent, sometimes it was Nathanael who helped him to recover, sometimes Peter, and not infrequently one of the Alphaeus twins. When he was most depressed, unfortunately he always tried to avoid coming in direct contact with Jesus. But the Master knew all about this, and had an understanding sympathy for his apostle when he was thus afflicted with depression and harassed by doubts. Sometimes Thomas would get permission from Andrew to go off by himself for a day or two. But he soon learned that such a course was not wise. He early found that it was best, when he was downhearted, to stick close to his work and to remain near his associates. But no matter what happened in his emotional life, he kept right on being an apostle. When the time actually came to move forward, it was always Thomas who said, "Let's go." Thomas is the great example of a human being who has doubts, faces them, and wins. He had a great mind. He was no carping critic. He was a logical thinker. He was the acid test of Jesus and his fellow apostles. If Jesus and his work had not been genuine, it could not have held a man like Thomas from the start to the finish. He had a keen and sure sense of fact. At the first appearance of fraud or deception, Thomas would have forsaken them all. Scientists may not fully understand all about Jesus and his work on earth, But there lived and worked with the Master and his human associates a man whose mind was that of a true scientist, Thomas Didymus, and he believed in Jesus of Nazareth. Thomas had a trying time during the days of the trial and crucifixion. He was, for a season, in the depths of despair. But he rallied his courage, stuck to the apostles, and was present with them to welcome Jesus on the Sea of Galilee. For a while he succumbed to his doubting depression, but eventually rallied his faith and courage. He gave wise counsel to the apostles after Pentecost, and when persecution scattered the believers, went to Cyprus, Crete, the North African coast, and Sicily, preaching the glad tidings of the kingdom and baptizing believers. And Thomas continued preaching and baptizing until he was apprehended by the agents of the Roman government and was put to death in Malta. Just a few weeks before his death, he had begun the writing of the life and teachings of Jesus. 9 and 10. James and Judas Alphaeus. James and Judas, the sons of Alphaeus, the twin fishermen living near Charessa, were the 9th and 10th apostles, and were chosen by James and John Zebedee. They were 26 years old and married, James having 3 children, Judas 2. There is not much to be said about these 2 commonplace fisher folk. They loved their master and Jesus loved them, but they never interrupted his discourses with questions. They understood very little about the philosophical discussions or the theological debates of their fellow apostles, but they rejoiced to find themselves numbered among such a group of mighty men. These 2 men were almost identical in personal appearance, mental characteristics, and extent of spiritual perception. What may be said of one should be recorded of the other. Andrew assigned them to the work of policing the multitudes. They were the chief ushers of the preaching hours, and in fact the general servants and errand boys of the 12. They helped Philip with the supplies. They carried money to the families for Nathanael, and always were they ready to lend a helping hand to any one of the apostles. The multitudes of the common people were greatly encouraged to find 2 like themselves honored with places among the apostles. By their very acceptance as apostles, these mediocre twins were the means of bringing a host of faint-hearted believers into the kingdom. And, too, the common people took more kindly to the idea of being directed and managed by official ushers who were very much like themselves. James and Judas, who were also called Thaddeus and Lebbaeus, had neither strong points nor weak points. The nicknames given them by the disciples were good-natured designations of mediocrity. They were the least of all the apostles. They knew it and felt cheerful about it. James Alphaeus especially loved Jesus because of the Master's simplicity. These twins could not comprehend the mind of Jesus, but they did grasp the sympathetic bond between themselves and the heart of their Master. Their minds were not of a high order. They might even reverently be called stupid. But they had a real experience in their spiritual natures. They believed in Jesus. They were sons of God and fellows of the kingdom. Judas Alphaeus was drawn toward Jesus because of the Master's unostentatious humility. Such humility linked with such personal dignity made a great appeal to Judas. The fact that Jesus would always enjoin silence regarding his unusual acts made a great impression on this simple child of nature. The twins were good-natured, simple-minded helpers, and everybody loved them. Jesus welcomed these young men of one talent to positions of honor on his personal staff in the kingdom because there are untold millions of other such simple and fear-ridden souls on the worlds of space whom he likewise wishes to welcome into active and believing fellowship with himself and his outpoured Spirit of truth. Jesus does not look down upon littleness, only upon evil and sin. James and Judas were little, but they were also faithful. They were simple and ignorant, but they were also big-hearted, kind, and generous. And how gratefully proud were these humble men on that day when the Master refused to accept a certain rich man as an evangelist unless he would sell his goods and help the poor. When the people heard this and beheld the twins among his counselors, they knew of a certainty that Jesus was no respecter of persons, but only a divine institution, the kingdom of heaven, could ever have been built upon such a mediocre human foundation. Only once or twice in all their association with Jesus did the twins venture to ask questions in public. Judas was once intrigued into asking Jesus a question when the Master had talked about revealing himself openly to the world. He felt a little disappointed that there were to be no more secrets among the 12, and he made bold to ask, "But, Master, when you do thus declare yourself to the world, how will you favor us with special manifestations of your goodness?" The twins served faithfully until the end, until the dark days of trial, crucifixion, and despair. They never lost their heart faith in Jesus, and, save John, they were the first to believe in his resurrection. But they could not comprehend the establishment of the kingdom. Soon after their Master was crucified, they returned to their families and nets. Their work was done. They had not the ability to go on in the more complex battles of the kingdom. But they lived and died conscious of having been honored and blessed with 4 years of close and personal association with a Son of God, the sovereign maker of a universe. 11. Simon the Zealot. Simon Zelotes, the 11th apostle, was chosen by Simon Peter. He was an able man of good ancestry and lived with his family at Capernaum. He was 28 years old when he became attached to the apostles. He was a fiery agitator and was also a man who spoke much without thinking. He had been a merchant in Capernaum before he turned his entire attention to the patriotic organization of the Zealots. Simon Zelotes was given charge of the diversions and relaxation of the apostolic group, and he was a very efficient organizer of the play life and recreational activities of the 12. Simon's strength was his inspirational loyalty. When the apostles found a man or woman who floundered in indecision about entering the kingdom, they would send for Simon. It usually required only about 15 minutes for this enthusiastic advocate of salvation through faith in God to settle all doubts and remove all indecision, to see a new soul born into the liberty of faith and the joy of salvation. Simon's great weakness was his material mindedness. He could not quickly change himself from a Jewish nationalist to a spiritually minded internationalist. 4 years was too short a time in which to make such an intellectual and emotional transformation. But Jesus was always patient with him. The one thing about Jesus which Simon so much admired was the Master's calmness, his assurance, poise, and inexplicable composure. Although Simon was a rabid revolutionist, a fearless firebrand of agitation, he gradually subdued his fiery nature until he became a powerful and effective preacher of peace on earth and goodwill among men. Simon was a great debater. He did like to argue, and when it came to dealing with the legalistic minds of the educated Jews or the intellectual quibblings of the Greeks, the task was always assigned to Simon. He was a rebel by nature and an iconoclast by training. But Jesus won him for the higher concepts of the kingdom of heaven. He had always identified himself with the party of protest, but he now joined the party of progress, unlimited and eternal progression of spirit and truth. Simon was a man of intense loyalties and warm personal devotions, and he did profoundly love Jesus. Jesus was not afraid to identify himself with businessmen, laboring men, optimists, pessimists, philosophers, skeptics, publicans, politicians, and patriots. The Master had many talks with Simon, but he never fully succeeded in making an internationalist out of this ardent Jewish nationalist. Jesus often told Simon that it was proper to want to see the social, economic, and political orders improved. But he would always add, "That is not the business of the kingdom of heaven." We must be dedicated to the doing of the Father's will. Our business is to be ambassadors of a spiritual government on high, and we must not immediately concern ourselves with aught but the representation of the will and character of the Divine Father, who stands at the head of the government whose credentials we bear. It was all difficult for Simon to comprehend, but gradually he began to grasp something of the meaning of the Master's teaching. After the dispersion because of the Jerusalem persecutions, Simon went into temporary retirement. He was literally crushed. As a nationalist patriot, he had surrendered in deference to Jesus' teachings. Now all was lost. He was in despair, but in a few years he rallied his hopes and went forth to proclaim the gospel of the kingdom. He went to Alexandria, and after working up the Nile, penetrated into the heart of Africa, everywhere preaching the gospel of Jesus and baptizing believers. Thus he labored until he was an old man and feeble, and he died and was buried in the heart of Africa. 12. Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot, the 12th apostle, was chosen by Nathanael. He was born in Kerioth, a small town in southern Judea. When he was a lad, his parents moved to Jericho, where he lived and had been employed in his father's various business enterprises until he became interested in the preaching and work of John the Baptist. Judas's parents were Sadducees, and when their son joined John's disciples, they disowned him. When Nathanael met Judas at Tarichea, he was seeking employment with a fish-drying enterprise at the lower end of the Sea of Galilee. He was 30 years of age and unmarried when he joined the apostles. He was probably the best educated man among the 12 and the only Judean in the Master's apostolic family. Judas had no outstanding trait of personal strength, though he had many outwardly appearing traits of culture and habits of training. He was a good thinker, but not always a truly honest thinker. Judas did not really understand himself. He was not really sincere in dealing with himself. Andrew appointed Judas treasurer of the 12, a position which he was eminently fitted to hold, and up to the time of the betrayal of his master, he discharged the responsibilities of his office honestly, faithfully, and most efficiently. There was no special trait about Jesus which Judas admired above the generally attractive and exquisitely charming personality of the Master. Judas was never able to rise above his Judean prejudices against his Galilean associates. He would even criticize in his mind many things about Jesus. Him whom 11 of the apostles looked upon as the perfect man, as the one altogether lovely and the chiefest among 10,000. This self-satisfied Judean often dared to criticize in his own heart. He really entertained the notion that Jesus was timid and somewhat afraid to assert his own power and authority. Judas was a good businessman. It required tact, ability, and patience as well as painstaking devotion to manage the financial affairs of such an idealist as Jesus, to say nothing of wrestling with the helter-skelter business methods of some of his apostles. Judas really was a great executive, a far-seeing and able financier, and he was a stickler for organization. None of the 12 ever criticized Judas. As far as they could see, Judas Iscariot was a matchless treasurer, a learned man, a loyal though sometimes critical apostle, and in every sense of the word, a great success. The apostles loved Judas. He was really one of them. He must have believed in Jesus, but we doubt whether he really loved the Master with a whole heart. The case of Judas illustrates the truthfulness of that saying, "There is a way that seems right to a man, but the end thereof is death." It is altogether possible to fall victim to the peaceful deception of pleasant adjustment to the paths of sin and death. Be assured that Judas was always financially loyal to his master and his fellow apostles. Money could never have been the motive for his betrayal of the Master. Judas was an only son of unwise parents. When very young, he was pampered and petted. He was a spoiled child. As he grew up, he had exaggerated ideas about his self-importance. He was a poor loser. He had loose and distorted ideas about fairness. He was given to the indulgence of hate and suspicion. He was an expert at misinterpretation of the words and acts of his friends. All through his life, Judas had cultivated the habit of getting even with those whom he fancied had mistreated him. His sense of values and loyalties was defective. To Jesus, Judas was a faith adventure. From the beginning, the Master fully understood the weakness of this apostle and well knew the dangers of admitting him to fellowship. But it is the nature of the sons of God to give every created being a full and equal chance for salvation and survival. Jesus wanted not only the mortals of this world, but the onlookers of innumerable other worlds to know that, when doubts exist as to the sincerity and wholeheartedness of a creature's devotion to the kingdom, it is the invariable practice of the judges of men fully to receive the doubtful candidate. The door of eternal life is wide open to all. Whosoever will may come. There are no restrictions or qualifications save the faith of the one who comes. This is just the reason why Jesus permitted Judas to go on to the very end, always doing everything possible to transform and save this weak and confused apostle. But when light is not honestly received and lived up to, it tends to become darkness within the soul. Judas grew intellectually regarding Jesus' teachings about the kingdom, but he did not make progress in the acquirement of spiritual character, as did the other apostles. He failed to make satisfactory personal progress in spiritual experience. Judas became increasingly a brooder over personal disappointment, and finally he became a victim of resentment. His feelings had been many times hurt, and he grew abnormally suspicious of his best friends, even of the Master. Presently he became obsessed with the idea of getting even, anything to avenge himself, yes, even betrayal of his associates and his Master. But these wicked and dangerous ideas did not take definite shape until the day when a grateful woman broke an expensive box of incense at Jesus' feet. This seemed wasteful to Judas, and when his public protest was so sweepingly disallowed by Jesus right there in the hearing of all, it was too much. That event determined the mobilization of all the accumulated hate, hurt, malice, prejudice, jealousy, and revenge of a lifetime, and he made up his mind to get even with he knew not whom, but he crystallized all the evil of his nature upon the one innocent person in all the sordid drama of his unfortunate life, just because Jesus happened to be the chief actor in the episode which marked his passing from the progressive kingdom of light into that self-chosen domain of darkness. The Master many times, both privately and publicly, had warned Judas that he was slipping, but divine warnings are usually useless in dealing with embittered human nature. Jesus did everything possible consistent with man's moral freedom to prevent Judas's choosing to go the wrong way. The great test finally came. The son of resentment failed. He yielded to the sour and sordid dictates of a proud and vengeful mind of exaggerated self-importance and swiftly plunged on down into confusion, despair, and depravity. Judas then entered into the base and shameful intrigue to betray his Lord and Master, and quickly carried the nefarious scheme into effect. During the outworking of his anger-conceived plans of traitorous betrayal, he experienced moments of regret and shame, and in these lucid intervals he faint-heartedly conceived as a defense in his own mind the idea that Jesus might possibly exert his power and deliver himself at the last moment. When the sordid and sinful business was all over, this renegade mortal who thought lightly of selling his friend for 30 pieces of silver to satisfy his long-nursed craving for revenge rushed out and committed the final act in the drama of fleeing from the realities of mortal existence: suicide. The 11 apostles were horrified, stunned. Jesus regarded the betrayer only with pity. The worlds have found it difficult to forgive Judas, and his name has become eschewed throughout a far-flung universe.
Paper 140. The Ordination of the 12. Just before noon on Sunday, January 12, A.D. 27, Jesus called the apostles together for their ordination as public preachers of the gospel of the kingdom. The 12 were expecting to be called almost any day, so this morning they did not go out far from the shore to fish. Several of them were lingering near the shore, repairing their nets and tinkering with their fishing paraphernalia. As Jesus started down the seashore calling the apostles, he first hailed Andrew and Peter, who were fishing near the shore. Next he signaled to James and John, who were in a boat nearby, visiting with their father, Zebedee, and mending their nets. 2 by 2 he gathered up the other apostles, and when he had assembled all 12, he journeyed with them to the highlands north of Capernaum, where he proceeded to instruct them in preparation for their formal ordination. For once all 12 of the apostles were silent. Even Peter was in a reflective mood. At last the long-waited-for hour had come. They were going apart with the Master to participate in some sort of solemn ceremony of personal consecration and collective dedication to the sacred work of representing their Master in the proclamation of the coming of his Father's kingdom. 1. Preliminary instruction. Before the formal ordination service, Jesus spoke to the 12 as they were seated about him. "My brethren, this hour of the kingdom has come. I have brought you apart here with me to present you to the Father as ambassadors of the kingdom. Some of you heard me speak of this kingdom in the synagogue when you first were called. Each of you has learned more about the Father's kingdom since you have been with me working in the cities around about the Sea of Galilee. But just now I have something more to tell you concerning this kingdom. The new kingdom which my Father is about to set up in the hearts of his earth children is to be an everlasting dominion. There shall be no end of this rule of my Father in the hearts of those who desire to do his divine will. I declare to you that my Father is not the God of Jew or Gentile. Many shall come from the east and from the west to sit down with us in the Father's kingdom, while many of the children of Abraham will refuse to enter this new brotherhood of the rule of the Father's Spirit in the hearts of the children of men. The power of this kingdom shall consist not in the strength of armies nor in the might of riches, but rather in the glory of the divine Spirit that shall come to teach the minds and rule the hearts of the reborn citizens of this heavenly kingdom, the sons of God. This is the brotherhood of love, wherein righteousness reigns, and whose battle cry shall be, peace on earth and goodwill to all men. This kingdom, which you are so soon to go forth proclaiming, is the desire of the good men of all ages, the hope of all the earth, and the fulfillment of the wise promises of all the prophets. But for you, my children, and for all others who would follow you into this kingdom, there is set a severe test. Faith alone will pass you through its portals, but you must bring forth the fruits of my Father's Spirit if you would continue to ascend in the progressive life of the divine fellowship. Verily, verily, I say to you, not every one who says, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but rather he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Your message to the world shall be, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and in finding these, all other things essential to eternal survival shall be secured therewith. And now would I make it plain to you that this kingdom of my Father will not come with an outward show of power or with unseemly demonstration. You are not to go hence in the proclamation of the kingdom saying, it is here or it is there, for this kingdom of which you preach is God within you. Whosoever would become great in my Father's kingdom shall become a minister to all. And whosoever would be first among you, let him become the server of his brethren. But when you are once truly received as citizens in the heavenly kingdom, you are no longer servants, but sons, sons of the living God. And so shall this kingdom progress in the world until it shall break down every barrier and bring all men to know my Father and believe in the saving truth which I have come to declare. Even now is the kingdom at hand, and some of you will not die until you have seen the reign of God come in great power. And this which your eyes now behold, this small beginning of 12 commonplace men, shall multiply and grow, until eventually the whole earth shall be filled with the praise of my Father. And it will not be so much by the words you speak as by the lives you live that men will know you have been with me and have learned of the realities of the kingdom. And while I would lay no grievous burdens upon your minds, I am about to put upon your souls the solemn responsibility of representing me in the world when I shall presently leave you, as I now represent my Father in this life which I am living in the flesh. And when he had finished speaking, he stood up. 2. The Ordination. Jesus now instructed the 12 mortals who had just listened to his declaration concerning the kingdom to kneel in a circle about him. Then the Master placed his hands upon the head of each apostle, beginning with Judas Iscariot and ending with Andrew. When he had blessed them, he extended his hands and prayed, "My Father, I now bring to you these men, my messengers. From among our children on earth I have chosen these 12 to go forth to represent me as I came forth to represent you. Love them and be with them as you have loved and been with me. And now, my Father, give these men wisdom as I place all the affairs of the coming kingdom in their hands. And I would, if it is your will, tarry on earth a time to help them in their labors for the kingdom. And again, my Father, I thank you for these men, and I commit them to your keeping, while I go on to finish the work you have given me to do." When Jesus had finished praying, the apostles remained each man bowed in his place. And it was many minutes before even Peter dared lift up his eyes to look upon the Master. One by one they embraced Jesus, but no man said aught. A great silence pervaded the place, while a host of celestial beings looked down upon this solemn and sacred scene. The Creator of the universe, placing the affairs of the divine brotherhood of man under the direction of human minds. 3. The Ordination Sermon. Then Jesus spoke, saying, "Now that you are ambassadors of my Father's kingdom, you have thereby become a class of men separate and distinct from all other men on earth. You are not now as men among men, but as the enlightened citizens of another and heavenly country among the ignorant creatures of this dark world. It is not enough that you live as you were before this hour, but henceforth must you live as those who have tasted the glories of a better life and have been sent back to earth as ambassadors of the sovereign of that new and better world. Of the teacher, more is expected than of the pupil. Of the master, more is exacted than of the servant. Of the citizens of the heavenly kingdom, more is required than of the citizens of the earthly rule. Some of the things which I am about to say to you may seem hard, but you have elected to represent me in the world, even as I now represent the Father. And as my agents on earth, you will be obligated to abide by those teachings and practices which are reflective of my ideals of mortal living on the worlds of space, and which I exemplify in my earth life of revealing the Father who is in heaven. I send you forth to proclaim liberty to the spiritual captives, joy to those in the bondage of fear, and to heal the sick in accordance with the will of my Father in heaven. When you find my children in distress, speak encouragingly to them, saying, Happy are the poor in spirit, the humble, for theirs are the treasures of the kingdom of heaven. Happy are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Happy are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Happy are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And even so speak to my children these further words of spiritual comfort and promise. Happy are they who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Happy are they who weep, for they shall receive the spirit of rejoicing. Happy are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Happy are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Happy are they who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Happy are you when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. My brethren, as I send you forth, you are the salt of the earth, salt with a saving savor. But if this salt has lost its savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It is henceforth good for nothing but to be cast out and trodden under foot of men. You are the light of the world. A city set upon a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and be led to glorify your Father who is in heaven. I am sending you out into the world to represent me and to act as ambassadors of my Father's kingdom. And as you go forth to proclaim the glad tidings, put your trust in the Father whose messengers you are. Do not forcibly resist injustice. Put not your trust in the arm of the flesh. If your neighbor smites you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Be willing to suffer injustice rather than to go to law among yourselves. In kindness and with mercy, minister to all who are in distress and in need. I say to you, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you, and pray for those who despitefully use you. And whatsoever you believe that I would do to men, do you also to them. Your Father in heaven makes the sun to shine on the evil as well as upon the good. Likewise, he sends rain on the just and the unjust. You are the sons of God. Even more, you are now the ambassadors of my Father's kingdom. Be merciful, even as God is merciful, and in the eternal future of the kingdom you shall be perfect, even as your heavenly Father is perfect. You are commissioned to save men, not to judge them. At the end of your earth life, you will all expect mercy. Therefore do I require of you during your mortal life that you show mercy to all of your brethren in the flesh. Make not the mistake of trying to pluck a mote out of your brother's eye when there is a beam in your own eye. Having first cast the beam out of your own eye, you can the better see to cast the mote out of your brother's eye. Discern the truth clearly. Live the righteous life fearlessly, and so shall you be my apostles and my Father's ambassadors. You have heard it said, if the blind lead the blind, they both shall fall into the pit. If you would guide others into the kingdom, you must yourselves walk in the clear light of living truth. In all the business of the kingdom, I exhort you to show just judgment and keen wisdom. Present not that which is holy to dogs, neither cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample your gems under foot and turn to rend you. I warn you against false prophets who will come to you in sheep's clothing, while on the inside they are as ravening wolves. By their fruits you shall know them. Do men gather grapes from thorns, or figs from thistles? Even so, every good tree brings forth good fruit, but the corrupt tree bears evil fruit. A good tree cannot yield evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bring forth good fruit is presently hewn down and cast into the fire. In gaining an entrance into the kingdom of heaven, it is the motive that counts. My Father looks into the hearts of men and judges by their inner longings and their sincere intentions. In the great day of the kingdom judgment, many will say to me, "Did we not prophesy in your name, and by your name do many wonderful works?" But I will be compelled to say to them, "I never knew you. Depart from me, you who are false teachers." But every one who hears this charge and sincerely executes his commission to represent me before men, even as I have represented my Father to you, shall find an abundant entrance into my service and into the kingdom of the Heavenly Father. Never before had the apostles heard Jesus speak in this way, for he had talked to them as one having supreme authority. They came down from the mountain about sundown, but no man asked Jesus a question. 4. You are the salt of the earth. The so-called Sermon on the Mount is not the gospel of Jesus. It does contain much helpful instruction, but it was Jesus' ordination charge to the 12 apostles. It was the Master's personal commission to those who were to go on preaching the gospel and aspiring to represent him in the world of men, even as he was so eloquently and perfectly representative of his Father. You are the salt of the earth, salt with a saving savor. But if this salt has lost its savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It is henceforth good for nothing but to be cast out and trodden under foot of men. In Jesus' time, salt was precious. It was even used for money. The modern word salary is derived from salt. Salt not only flavors food, but it is also a preservative. It makes other things more tasty, and thus it serves by being spent. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and be led to glorify your Father who is in heaven. While light dispels darkness, it can also be so blinding as to confuse and frustrate. We are admonished to let our light so shine that our fellows will be guided into new and godly paths of enhanced living. Our light should so shine as not to attract attention to self. Even one's vocation can be utilized as an effective reflector for the dissemination of this light of life. Strong characters are not derived from not doing wrong, but rather from actually doing right. Unselfishness is the badge of human greatness. The highest levels of self-realization are attained by worship and service. The happy and effective person is motivated not by fear of wrongdoing, but by love of right doing. By their fruits you shall know them. Personality is basically changeless. That which changes, grows, is the moral character. The major error of modern religions is negativism. The tree which bears no fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Moral worth cannot be derived from mere repression, obeying the injunction, "Thou shalt not." Fear and shame are unworthy motivations for religious living. Religion is valid only when it reveals the fatherhood of God and enhances the brotherhood of men. An effective philosophy of living is formed by a combination of cosmic insight and the total of one's emotional reactions to the social and economic environment. Remember, while inherited urges cannot be fundamentally modified, emotional responses to such urges can be changed. Therefore, the moral nature can be modified, character can be improved. In the strong character, emotional responses are integrated and coordinated, and thus is produced a unified personality. Deficient unification weakens the moral nature and engenders unhappiness. Without a worthy goal, life becomes aimless and unprofitable, and much unhappiness results. Jesus' discourse at the ordination of the 12 constitutes a master philosophy of life. Jesus exhorted his followers to exercise experiential faith. He admonished them not to depend on mere intellectual assent, credulity, and established authority. Education should be a technique of learning, discovering the better methods of gratifying our natural and inherited urges, and happiness is the resulting total of these enhanced techniques of emotional satisfactions. Happiness is little dependent on environment, though pleasing surroundings may greatly contribute thereto. Every mortal really craves to be a complete person, to be perfect even as the Father in heaven is perfect, and such attainment is possible because in the last analysis, the universe is truly fatherly. 5. Fatherly and brotherly love. From the Sermon on the Mount to the discourse of the Last Supper, Jesus taught his followers to manifest fatherly love rather than brotherly love. Brotherly love would love your neighbor as you love yourself, and that would be adequate fulfillment of the Golden Rule. But fatherly affection would require that you should love your fellow mortals as Jesus loves you. Jesus loves mankind with a dual affection. He lived on earth as a twofold personality, human and divine. As the Son of God, he loves man with a fatherly love. He is man's creator, his universe father. As the Son of Man, Jesus loves mortals as a brother. He was truly a man among men. Jesus did not expect his followers to achieve an impossible manifestation of brotherly love, but he did expect them to so strive to be like God, to be perfect even as the Father in heaven is perfect, that they could begin to look upon man as God looks upon his creatures, and therefore could begin to love men as God loves them, to show forth the beginnings of a fatherly affection. In the course of these exhortations to the 12 apostles, Jesus sought to reveal this new concept of fatherly love as it is related to certain emotional attitudes concerned in making numerous environmental social adjustments. The Master introduced this momentous discourse by calling attention to 4 faith attitudes as the prelude to the subsequent portrayal of his 4 transcendent and supreme reactions of fatherly love, in contrast to the limitations of mere brotherly love. He first talked about those who were poor in spirit, hungered after righteousness, endured meekness, and who were pure in heart. Such spirit-discerning mortals could be expected to attain such levels of divine selflessness as to be able to attempt the amazing exercise of fatherly affection, that even as mourners they would be empowered to show mercy, promote peace, and endure persecutions, and throughout all of these trying situations to love even unlovely mankind with a fatherly love. A father's affection can attain levels of devotion that immeasurably transcend a brother's affection. The faith and the love of these beatitudes strengthen moral character and create happiness. Fear and anger weaken character and destroy happiness. This momentous sermon started out upon the note of happiness. 1. Happy are the poor in spirit, the humble. To a child, happiness is the satisfaction of immediate pleasure craving. The adult is willing to sow seeds of self-denial in order to reap subsequent harvests of augmented happiness. In Jesus' times and since, happiness has all too often been associated with the idea of the possession of wealth. In the story of the Pharisee and the publican praying in the temple, the one felt rich in spirit, egotistical, The other felt poor in spirit, humble. One was self-sufficient, the other was teachable and truth-seeking. The poor in spirit seek for goals of spiritual wealth, for God. And such seekers after truth do not have to wait for rewards in a distant future. They are rewarded now. They find the kingdom of heaven within their own hearts, and they experience such happiness now. 2. Happy are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Only those who feel poor in spirit will ever hunger for righteousness. Only the humble seek for divine strength and crave spiritual power. But it is most dangerous to knowingly engage in spiritual fasting in order to improve one's appetite for spiritual endowments. Physical fasting becomes dangerous after 4 or 5 days. One is apt to lose all desire for food. Prolonged fasting, either physical or spiritual, tends to destroy hunger. Experiential righteousness is a pleasure, not a duty. Jesus' righteousness is a dynamic love, fatherly, brotherly affection. It is not the negative or thou shalt not type of righteousness. How could one ever hunger for something negative, something not to do? It is not so easy to teach a child mind these first 2 of the Beatitudes, but the mature mind should grasp their significance. 3. Happy are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Genuine meekness has no relation to fear. It is rather an attitude of man cooperating with God. Your will be done. It embraces patience and forbearance and is motivated by an unshakable faith in a lawful and friendly universe. It masters all temptations to rebel against the divine leading. Jesus was the ideal meek man of Urantia, and he inherited a vast universe. 4. Happy are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Spiritual purity is not a negative quality, except that it does lack suspicion and revenge. In discussing purity, Jesus did not intend to deal exclusively with human sex attitudes. He referred more to that faith which man should have in his fellow man, that faith which a parent has in his child, and which enables him to love his fellows even as a father would love them. A father's love need not pamper, and it does not condone evil, but it is always anti-cynical. Fatherly love has singleness of purpose, and it always looks for the best in man. That is the attitude of a true parent. To see God by faith means to acquire true spiritual insight, and spiritual insight enhances a juster guidance, and these in the end augment God consciousness. And when you know the Father, you are confirmed in the assurance of divine sonship, and you can increasingly love each of your brothers in the flesh, not only as a brother with brotherly love, but also as a father with fatherly affection. It is easy to teach this admonition even to a child. Children are naturally trustful, and parents should see to it that they do not lose that simple faith. In dealing with children, avoid all deception and refrain from suggesting suspicion. Wisely help them to choose their heroes and select their life work. And then Jesus went on to instruct his followers in the realization of the chief purpose of all human struggling: perfection, even divine attainment. Always he admonished them, "Be you perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect." He did not exhort the 12 to love their neighbors as they loved themselves. That would have been a worthy achievement. It would have indicated the achievement of brotherly love. He rather admonished his apostles to love men as he had loved them, to love with a fatherly as well as a brotherly affection. And he illustrated this by pointing out 4 supreme reactions of fatherly love. 1. Happy are they who mourn, for they shall be comforted. So-called common sense or the best of logic would never suggest that happiness could be derived from mourning. But Jesus did not refer to outward or ostentatious mourning. He alluded to an emotional attitude of tender-heartedness. It is a great error to teach boys and young men that it is unmanly to show tenderness or otherwise to give evidence of emotional feeling or physical suffering. Sympathy is a worthy attribute of the male as well as the female. It is not necessary to be calloused in order to be manly. This is the wrong way to create courageous men. The world's great men have not been afraid to mourn. Moses, the mourner, was a greater man than either Samson or Goliath. Moses was a superb leader, but he was also a man of meekness. Being sensitive and responsive to human need creates genuine and lasting happiness, while such kindly attitudes safeguard the soul from the destructive influences of anger, hate, and suspicion. 2. Happy are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Mercy here denotes the height and depth and breadth of the truest friendship, loving kindness. Mercy sometimes may be passive, but here it is active and dynamic, supreme fatherliness. A loving parent experiences little difficulty in forgiving his child, even many times. And in an unspoiled child, the urge to relieve suffering is natural. Children are normally kind and sympathetic when old enough to appreciate actual conditions. 3. Happy are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Jesus' hearers were longing for military deliverance, not for peacemakers. But Jesus' peace is not of the pacific and negative kind. In the face of trials and persecutions, he said, "My peace I leave with you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid." This is the peace that prevents ruinous conflicts. Personal peace integrates personality. Social peace prevents fear, greed, and anger. Political peace prevents race antagonisms, national suspicions, and war. Peacemaking is the cure of distrust and suspicion. Children can easily be taught to function as peacemakers. They enjoy team activities. They like to play together. Said the Master at another time, "Whosoever will save his life shall lose it, but whosoever will lose his life shall find it." 4. Happy are they who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Happy are you when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. So often persecution does follow peace. But young people and brave adults never shun difficulty or danger. Greater love has no man than to lay down his life for his friends. And a fatherly love can freely do all these things, things which brotherly love can hardly encompass. And progress has always been the final harvest of persecution. Children always respond to the challenge of courage. Youth is ever willing to take a dare, and every child should early learn to sacrifice. And so it is revealed that the Beatitudes of the Sermon on the Mount are based on faith and love, and not on law, ethics, and duty. Fatherly love delights in returning good for evil, doing good in retaliation for injustice. 6. The evening of the ordination. Sunday evening, on reaching the home of Zebedee from the highlands north of Capernaum, Jesus and the 12 partook of a simple meal. Afterward, while Jesus went for a walk along the beach, the 12 talked among themselves. After a brief conference while the twins built a small fire to give them warmth and more light, Andrew went out to find Jesus, and when he had overtaken him, he said, "Master, my brethren are unable to comprehend what you have said about the kingdom. We do not feel able to begin this work until you have given us further instruction." I have come to ask you to join us in the garden and help us to understand the meaning of your words." And Jesus went with Andrew to meet with the apostles. When he had entered the garden, he gathered the apostles around him and taught them further, saying, "You find it difficult to receive my message because you would build the new teaching directly upon the old. But I declare that you must be reborn. You must start out afresh as little children and be willing to trust my teaching and believe in God. The new gospel of the kingdom cannot be made to conform to that which is. You have wrong ideas of the Son of Man and his mission on earth. But do not make the mistake of thinking that I have come to set aside the law and the prophets. I have not come to destroy, but to fulfill, to enlarge and illuminate. I come not to transgress the law, but rather to write these new commandments on the tablets of your hearts. I demand of you a righteousness that shall exceed the righteousness of those who seek to obtain the Father's favor by almsgiving, prayer, and fasting. If you would enter the kingdom, you must have a righteousness that consists in love, mercy, and truth, the sincere desire to do the will of my Father in heaven." Then said Simon Peter, "Master, if you have a new commandment, we would hear it. Reveal the new way to us." Jesus answered Peter, "You have heard it said by those who teach the law, 'You shall not kill, that whosoever kills shall be subject to judgment.' But I look beyond the act to uncover the motive. I declare to you that every one who is angry with his brother is in danger of condemnation. He who nurses hatred in his heart and plans vengeance in his mind stands in danger of judgment. You must judge your fellows by their deeds. The Father in heaven judges by the intent. You have heard the teachers of the law say, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that every man who looks upon a woman with intent to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. You can only judge men by their acts, but my Father looks into the hearts of his children and in mercy adjudges them in accordance with their intents and real desires." Jesus was minded to go on discussing the other commandments when James Zebedee interrupted him, asking, "Master, what shall we teach the people regarding divorcement? Shall we allow a man to divorce his wife as Moses has directed?" And when Jesus heard this question, he said, "I have not come to legislate, but to enlighten. I have come not to reform the kingdoms of this world, but rather to establish the kingdom of heaven. It is not the will of the Father that I should yield to the temptation to teach you rules of government, trade, or social behavior, which, while they might be good for today, would be far from suitable for the society of another age. I am on earth solely to comfort the minds, liberate the spirits, and save the souls of men. But I will say concerning this question of divorcement that, while Moses looked with favor upon such things, it was not so in the days of Adam and in the garden." After the apostles had talked among themselves for a short time, Jesus went on to say, "Always must you recognize the two viewpoints of all mortal conduct, the human and the divine, the ways of the flesh and the way of the Spirit, the estimate of time and the viewpoint of eternity." And though the 12 could not comprehend all that he taught them, they were truly helped by this instruction. And then said Jesus, "But you will stumble over my teaching, because you are wont to interpret my message literally. You are slow to discern the spirit of my teaching. Again must you remember that you are my messengers. You are beholden to live your lives as I have in spirit lived mine. You are my personal representatives, but do not err in expecting all men to live as you do in every particular. Also must you remember that I have sheep not of this flock, and that I am beholden to them also, to the end that I must provide for them the pattern of doing the will of God while living the life of the mortal nature." Then asked Nathanael, "Master, shall we give no place to justice? The law of Moses says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. What shall we say?" And Jesus answered, "You shall return good for evil. My messengers must not strive with men, but be gentle toward all. Measure for measure shall not be your rule. The rulers of men may have such laws, but not so in the kingdom. Mercy always shall determine your judgments, and love your conduct. And if these are hard sayings, you can even now turn back. If you find the requirements of apostleship too hard, you may return to the less rigorous pathway of discipleship." On hearing these startling words, the apostles drew apart by themselves for a while, but they soon returned, and Peter said, "Master, we would go on with you. Not one of us would turn back. We are fully prepared to pay the extra price. We will drink the cup. We would be apostles, not merely disciples." When Jesus heard this, he said, "Be willing, then, to take up your responsibilities and follow me. Do your good deeds in secret. When you give alms, let not the left hand know what the right hand does. And when you pray, go apart by yourselves and use not vain repetitions and meaningless phrases. Always remember that the Father knows what you need even before you ask Him. And be not given to fasting with a sad countenance to be seen by men. As my chosen apostles, now set apart for the service of the kingdom, lay not up for yourselves treasures on earth, but by your unselfish service lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. For where your treasures are, there will your hearts be also. The lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is generous, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is selfish, the whole body will be filled with darkness. If the very light which is in you is turned to darkness, how great is that darkness!" And then Thomas asked Jesus if they should continue having everything in common. Said the Master, "Yes, my brethren, I would that we should live together as one understanding family. You are entrusted with a great work, and I crave your undivided service. You know that it has been well said, 'No man can serve two masters.' You cannot sincerely worship God and at the same time wholeheartedly serve Mammon. Having now enlisted unreservedly in the work of the kingdom, be not anxious for your lives, much less be concerned with what you shall eat or what you shall drink, nor yet for your bodies, what clothing you shall wear. Already have you learned that willing hands and earnest hearts shall not go hungry. And now, when you prepare to devote all of your energies to the work of the kingdom, be assured that the Father will not be unmindful of your needs. Seek first the kingdom of God, and when you have found entrance thereto, all things needful shall be added to you. Be not therefore unduly anxious for the morrow. Sufficient for the day is the trouble thereof." When Jesus saw they were disposed to stay up all night to ask questions, he said to them, "My brethren, you are earthen vessels. It is best for you to go to your rest so as to be ready for the morrow's work." But sleep had departed from their eyes. Peter ventured to request of his master that, "I have just a little private talk with you. Not that I would have secrets from my brethren, but I have a troubled spirit, and if, perchance, I should deserve a rebuke from my master, I could the better endure it alone with you." And Jesus said, "Come with me, Peter," leading the way into the house. When Peter returned from the presence of his master, much cheered and greatly encouraged, James decided to go in to talk with Jesus. And so on through the early hours of the morning, the other apostles went in one by one to talk with the Master. When they had all held personal conferences with him save the twins who had fallen asleep, Andrew went in to Jesus and said, "Master, the twins have fallen asleep in the garden by the fire. Shall I arouse them to inquire if they would also talk with you?" And Jesus smilingly said to Andrew, "They do well. Trouble them not." And now the night was passing. The light of another day was dawning. 7. The week following the ordination. After a few hours' sleep, when the 12 were assembled for a late breakfast with Jesus, he said, "Now must you begin your work of preaching the glad tidings and instructing believers. Make ready to go to Jerusalem." After Jesus had spoken, Thomas mustered up courage to say, "I know, Master, that we should now be ready to enter upon the work, but I fear we are not yet able to accomplish this great undertaking. Would you consent for us to stay hereabouts for just a few days more before we begin the work of the kingdom?" And when Jesus saw that all of his apostles were possessed by this same fear, he said, "It shall be as you have requested. We will remain here over the Sabbath day." For weeks and weeks, small groups of earnest truth-seekers, together with curious spectators, had been coming to Bethsaida to see Jesus. Already word about him had spread over the countryside. Inquiring groups had come from cities as far away as Tyre, Sidon, Damascus, Caesarea, and Jerusalem. Heretofore Jesus had greeted these people and taught them concerning the kingdom, but the Master now turned this work over to the 12. Andrew would select one of the apostles and assign him to a group of visitors, and sometimes all 12 of them were so engaged. For 2 days they worked, teaching by day and holding private conferences late into the night. On the 3rd day, Jesus visited with Zebedee and Salome while he sent his apostles off to go fishing, seek carefree change, or perchance visit your families. On Thursday they returned for 3 more days of teaching. During this week of rehearsing, Jesus many times repeated to his apostles the 2 great motives of his post-baptismal mission on earth. 1. To reveal the Father to man. 2. To lead men to become son-conscious, to faith-realize that they are the children of the Most High. 1 week of this varied experience did much for the 12. Some even became over-self-confident. At the last conference, the night after the Sabbath, Peter and James came to Jesus, saying, "We are ready. Let us now go forth to take the kingdom." To which Jesus replied, "May your wisdom equal your zeal, and your courage atone for your ignorance." Though the apostles failed to comprehend much of his teaching, they did not fail to grasp the significance of the charmingly beautiful life he lived with them. 8. Thursday afternoon on the lake. Jesus well knew that his apostles were not fully assimilating his teachings. He decided to give some special instruction to Peter, James, and John, hoping they would be able to clarify the ideas of their associates. He saw that while some features of the idea of a spiritual kingdom were being grasped by the 12, they steadfastly persisted in attaching these new spiritual teachings directly onto their old and entrenched literal concepts of the kingdom of heaven as a restoration of David's throne and the reestablishment of Israel as a temporal power on earth. Accordingly, on Thursday afternoon, Jesus went out from the shore in a boat with Peter, James, and John to talk over the affairs of the kingdom. This was a 4 hours teaching conference embracing scores of questions and answers, and may most profitably be put in this record by reorganizing the summary of this momentous afternoon as it was given by Simon Peter to his brother Andrew the following morning. 1. Doing the Father's will. Jesus' teaching to trust in the overcare of the Heavenly Father was not a blind and passive fatalism. He quoted with approval on this afternoon an old Hebrew saying, "He who will not work shall not eat." He pointed to his own experience as sufficient commentary on his teachings. His precepts about trusting the Father must not be adjudged by the social or economic conditions of modern times or any other age. His instruction embraces the ideal principles of living near God in all ages and on all worlds. Jesus made clear to the 3 the difference between the requirements of apostleship and discipleship, And even then he did not forbid the exercise of prudence and foresight by the 12. What he preached against was not forethought, but anxiety, worry. He taught the active and alert submission to God's will. In answer to many of their questions regarding frugality and thriftiness, he simply called attention to his life as carpenter, boatmaker, and fisherman, and to his careful organization of the 12. He sought to make it clear that the world is not to be regarded as an enemy, that the circumstances of life constitute a divine dispensation working along with the children of God. Jesus had great difficulty in getting them to understand his personal practice of non-resistance. He absolutely refused to defend himself, and it appeared to the apostles that he would be pleased if they would pursue the same policy. He taught them not to resist evil, not to combat injustice or injury, but he did not teach passive tolerance of wrongdoing. And he made it plain on this afternoon that he approved of the social punishment of evildoers and criminals, and that the civil government must sometimes employ force for the maintenance of social order and in the execution of justice. He never ceased to warn his disciples against the evil practice of retaliation. He made no allowance for revenge, the idea of getting even. He deplored the holding of grudges. He disallowed the idea of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. He discountenanced the whole concept of private and personal revenge, assigning these matters to civil government, on the one hand, and to the judgment of God, on the other. He made it clear to the three that his teachings applied to the individual, not the state. He summarized his instructions up to that time regarding these matters as, "Love your enemies. Remember the moral claims of human brotherhood. The futility of evil. A wrong is not righted by vengeance. Do not make the mistake of fighting evil with its own weapons. Have faith, confidence in the eventual triumph of divine justice and eternal goodness." 2. Political attitude. He cautioned his apostles to be discreet in their remarks concerning the strained relations then existing between the Jewish people and the Roman government. He forbade them to become in any way embroiled in these difficulties. He was always careful to avoid the political snares of his enemies, ever making reply, "Render to Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and to God the things which are God's." He refused to have his attention diverted from his mission of establishing a new way of salvation. He would not permit himself to be concerned about anything else. In his personal life, he was always duly observant of all civil laws and regulations. In all his public teachings, he ignored the civic, social, and economic realms. He told the three apostles that he was concerned only with the principles of man's inner and personal spiritual life. Jesus was not, therefore, a political reformer. He did not come to reorganize the world. Even if he had done this, it would have been applicable only to that day and generation. Nevertheless, he did show man the best way of living, and no generation is exempt from the labor of discovering how best to adapt Jesus' life to its own problems. But never make the mistake of identifying Jesus' teachings with any political or economic theory, with any social or industrial system. 3. Social attitude. The Jewish rabbis had long debated the question, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus came presenting the idea of active and spontaneous kindness, a love of one's fellow men so genuine that it expanded the neighborhood to include the whole world, thereby making all men one's neighbors. But with all this, Jesus was interested only in the individual, not the mass. Jesus was not a sociologist, but he did labor to break down all forms of selfish isolation. He taught pure sympathy, compassion. Michael of Nebadon is a mercy-dominated son. Compassion is his very nature. The Master did not say that men should never entertain their friends at meat, but he did say that his followers should make feasts for the poor and the unfortunate. Jesus had a firm sense of justice, but it was always tempered with mercy. He did not teach his apostles that they were to be imposed upon by social parasites or professional alms-seekers. The nearest he came to making sociological pronouncements was to say, "Judge not, that you be not judged." He made it clear that indiscriminate kindness may be blamed for many social evils. The following day, Jesus definitely instructed Judas that no apostolic funds were to be given out as alms except upon his request or upon the joint petition of 2 of the apostles. In all these matters, it was the practice of Jesus always to say, "Be as wise as serpents, but as harmless as doves." It seemed to be his purpose in all social situations to teach patience, tolerance, and forgiveness. The family occupied the very center of Jesus' philosophy of life, here and hereafter. He based his teachings about God on the family, while he sought to correct the Jewish tendency to over-honor ancestors. He exalted family life as the highest human duty, but made it plain that family relationships must not interfere with religious obligations. He called attention to the fact that the family is a temporal institution, that it does not survive death. Jesus did not hesitate to give up his family when the family ran counter to the Father's will. He taught the new and larger brotherhood of man, the sons of God. In Jesus' time, divorce practices were lax in Palestine and throughout the Roman Empire. He repeatedly refused to lay down laws regarding marriage and divorce. But many of Jesus' early followers had strong opinions on divorce and did not hesitate to attribute them to him. All of the New Testament writers held to these more stringent and advanced ideas about divorce, except John Mark. 4. Economic attitude. Jesus worked, lived, and traded in the world as he found it. He was not an economic reformer, although he did frequently call attention to the injustice of the unequal distribution of wealth. But he did not offer any suggestions by way of remedy. He made it plain to the 3 that while his apostles were not to hold property, he was not preaching against wealth and property, merely its unequal and unfair distribution. He recognized the need for social justice and industrial fairness, but he offered no rules for their attainment. He never taught his followers to avoid earthly possessions, only his 12 apostles. Luke, the physician, was a strong believer in social equality, and he did much to interpret Jesus' sayings in harmony with his personal beliefs. Jesus never personally directed his followers to adopt a communal mode of life. He made no pronouncement of any sort regarding such matters. Jesus frequently warned his listeners against covetousness, declaring that a man's happiness consists not in the abundance of his material possessions. He constantly reiterated, "What shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" He made no direct attack on the possession of property, but he did insist that it is eternally essential that spiritual values come first. In his later teachings, he sought to correct many erroneous Urantia views of life by narrating numerous parables which he presented in the course of his public ministry. Jesus never intended to formulate economic theories. He well knew that each age must evolve its own remedies for existing troubles. And if Jesus were on earth today, living his life in the flesh, he would be a great disappointment to the majority of good men and women for the simple reason that he would not take sides in present-day political, social, or economic disputes. He would remain grandly aloof while teaching you how to perfect your inner spiritual life so as to render you many-fold more competent to attack the solution of your purely human problems. Jesus would make all men godlike, and then stand by sympathetically while these sons of God solve their own political, social, and economic problems. It was not wealth that he denounced, but what wealth does to the majority of its devotees. On this Thursday afternoon, Jesus first told his associates that it is more blessed to give than to receive. 5. Personal religion. You, as did his apostles, should the better understand Jesus' teachings by his life. He lived a perfected life on Urantia, and his unique teachings can only be understood when that life is visualized in its immediate background. It is his life, and not his lessons to the 12 or his sermons to the multitudes, that will assist most in revealing the Father's divine character and loving personality. Jesus did not attack the teachings of the Hebrew prophets or the Greek moralists. The Master recognized the many good things which these great teachers stood for, but he had come down to earth to teach something additional: the voluntary conformity of man's will to God's will. Jesus did not want simply to produce a religious man, a mortal wholly occupied with religious feelings and actuated only by spiritual impulses. Could you have had but one look at him, you would have known that Jesus was a real man of great experience in the things of this world. The teachings of Jesus in this respect have been grossly perverted and much misrepresented all down through the centuries of the Christian era. You have also held perverted ideas about the Master's meekness and humility. What he aimed at in his life appears to have been a superb self-respect. He only advised man to humble himself that he might become truly exalted. What he really aimed at was true humility toward God. He placed great value upon sincerity, a pure heart. Fidelity was a cardinal virtue in his estimate of character, while courage was the very heart of his teachings. Fear not was his watchword, and patient endurance his ideal of strength of character. The teachings of Jesus constitute a religion of valor, courage, and heroism. And this is just why he chose as his personal representatives 12 commonplace men, the majority of whom were rugged, virile, and manly fishermen. Jesus had little to say about the social vices of his day. Seldom did he make reference to moral delinquency. He was a positive teacher of true virtue. He studiously avoided the negative method of imparting instruction. He refused to advertise evil. He was not even a moral reformer. He well knew, and so taught his apostles, that the sensual urges of mankind are not suppressed by either religious rebuke or legal prohibitions. His few denunciations were largely directed against pride, cruelty, oppression, and hypocrisy. Jesus did not vehemently denounce even the Pharisees, as did John. He knew many of the scribes and Pharisees were honest of heart. He understood their enslaving bondage to religious traditions. Jesus laid great emphasis on first making the tree good. He impressed the three that he valued the whole life, not just a certain few special virtues. The one thing which John gained from this day's teaching was that the heart of Jesus' religion consisted in the acquirement of a compassionate character coupled with a personality motivated to do the will of the Father in heaven. Peter grasped the idea that the gospel they were about to proclaim was really a fresh beginning for the whole human race. He conveyed this impression subsequently to Paul, who formulated therefrom his doctrine of Christ as the second Adam. James grasped the thrilling truth that Jesus wanted his children on earth to live as though they were already citizens of the completed heavenly kingdom. Jesus knew men were different, and he so taught his apostles. He constantly exhorted them to refrain from trying to mold the disciples and believers according to some set pattern. He sought to allow each soul to develop in its own way, a perfecting and separate individual before God. In answer to one of Peter's many questions, the Master said, "I want to set men free so that they can start out afresh as little children upon the new and better life." Jesus always insisted that true goodness must be unconscious in bestowing charity, not allowing the left hand to know what the right hand does. The three apostles were shocked this afternoon when they realized that their Master's religion made no provision for spiritual self-examination. All religions before and after the times of Jesus, even Christianity, carefully provide for conscientious self-examination. But not so with the religion of Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus' philosophy of life is without religious introspection. The carpenter's son never taught character building. He taught character growth, declaring that the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. But Jesus said nothing which would prescribe self-analysis as a prevention of conceited egotism. The right to enter the kingdom is conditioned by faith, personal belief. The cost of remaining in the progressive ascent of the kingdom is the pearl of great price, in order to possess which a man sells all that he has. The teaching of Jesus is a religion for everybody, not alone for weaklings and slaves. His religion never became crystallized during his day into creeds and theological laws. He left not a line of writing behind him. His life and teachings were bequeathed to the universe as an inspirational and idealistic inheritance suitable for the spiritual guidance and moral instruction of all ages on all worlds. And even today, Jesus' teaching stands apart from all religions as such, albeit it is the living hope of every one of them. Jesus did not teach his apostles that religion is man's only earthly pursuit. That was the Jewish idea of serving God. But he did insist that religion was the exclusive business of the 12. Jesus taught nothing to deter his believers from the pursuit of genuine culture. He only detracted from the tradition-bound religious schools of Jerusalem. He was liberal, big-hearted, learned, and tolerant. Self-conscious piety had no place in his philosophy of righteous living. The Master offered no solutions for the non-religious problems of his own age, nor for any subsequent age. Jesus wished to develop spiritual insight into eternal realities and to stimulate initiative in the originality of living. He concerned himself exclusively with the underlying and permanent spiritual needs of the human race. He revealed a goodness equal to God. He exalted love, truth, beauty, and goodness as the divine ideal and the eternal reality. The Master came to create in man a new spirit, a new will, to impart a new capacity for knowing the truth, experiencing compassion, and choosing goodness, the will to be in harmony with God's will, coupled with the eternal urge to become perfect, even as the Father in heaven is perfect. 9. The Day of Consecration. The next Sabbath day Jesus devoted to his apostles, journeying back to the highland where he had ordained them, and there, after a long and beautifully touching personal message of encouragement, he engaged in the solemn act of the consecration of the 12. This Sabbath afternoon, Jesus assembled the apostles around him on the hillside and gave them into the hands of his heavenly Father in preparation for the day when he would be compelled to leave them alone in the world. There was no new teaching on this occasion, just visiting and communion. Jesus reviewed many features of the ordination sermon, delivered on this same spot, and then, calling them before him one by one, he commissioned them to go forth in the world as his representatives. The Master's consecration charge was, "Go into all the world and preach the glad tidings of the kingdom, liberate spiritual captives, comfort the oppressed, and minister to the afflicted. Freely you have received, freely give." Jesus advised them to take neither money nor extra clothing, saying, "The laborer is worthy of his hire." And finally he said, "Behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be you therefore as wise as serpents and as harmless as doves. But take heed, for your enemies will bring you up before their councils, while in their synagogues they will castigate you. Before governors and rulers you will be brought, because you believe this gospel, and your very testimony shall be a witness for me to them. And when they lead you to judgment, be not anxious about what you shall say, for the Spirit of my Father indwells you, and will at such a time speak through you. Some of you will be put to death, and before you establish the kingdom on earth, you will be hated by many peoples because of this gospel. But fear not, I will be with you, and my Spirit shall go before you into all the world, and my Father's presence will abide with you while you go first to the Jews, then to the Gentiles. And when they came down from the mountain, they journeyed back to their home in Zebedee's house. 10. The evening after the consecration. That evening, while teaching in the house, for it had begun to rain, Jesus talked at great length, trying to show the 12 what they must be, not what they must do. They knew only a religion that imposed the doing of certain things as the means of attaining righteousness, salvation. But Jesus would reiterate, in the kingdom you must be righteous in order to do the work. Many times did he repeat, Be you therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. All the while was the Master explaining to his bewildered apostles that the salvation which he had come to bring to the world was to be had only by believing, by simple and sincere faith. Said Jesus, John preached a baptism of repentance, sorrow for the old way of living. You are to proclaim the baptism of fellowship with God. Preach repentance to those who stand in need of such teaching, but to those already seeking sincere entrance to the kingdom, open the doors wide and bid them enter into the joyous fellowship of the sons of God. But it was a difficult task to persuade these Galilean fishermen that in the kingdom, being righteous by faith must precede doing righteousness in the daily life of the mortals of earth. Another great handicap in this work of teaching the 12 was their tendency to take highly idealistic and spiritual principles of religious truth and remake them into concrete rules of personal conduct. Jesus would present to them the beautiful spirit of the soul's attitude, but they insisted on translating such teachings into rules of personal behavior. Many times when they did make sure to remember what the Master said, they were almost certain to forget what he did not say. But they slowly assimilated his teaching because Jesus was all that he taught. What they could not gain from his verbal instruction, they gradually acquired by living with him. It was not apparent to the apostles that their Master was engaged in living a life of spiritual inspiration for every person of every age on every world of a far-flung universe. Notwithstanding what Jesus told them from time to time, the apostles did not grasp the idea that he was doing a work on this world, but for all other worlds in his vast creation. Jesus lived his earth life on Urantia not to set a personal example of mortal living for the men and women of this world, but rather to create a high spiritual and inspirational ideal for all mortal beings on all worlds. This same evening, Thomas asked Jesus, Master, you say that we must become as little children before we can gain entrance to the Father's kingdom, and yet you have warned us not to be deceived by false prophets, nor to become guilty of casting our pearls before swine. Now, I am honestly puzzled. I cannot understand your teaching. Jesus replied to Thomas, How long shall I bear with you? Ever you insist on making literal all that I teach. When I ask you to become as little children as the price of entering the kingdom, I referred not to ease of deception, mere willingness to believe, nor to quickness to trust pleasing strangers. What I did desire that you should gather from the illustration was the child-father relationship. You are the child, and it is your Father's kingdom you seek to enter. There is present that natural affection between every normal child and its father, which ensures an understanding and loving relationship, and which forever precludes all disposition to bargain for the Father's love and mercy. And the gospel you are going forth to preach has to do with a salvation growing out of the faith realization of this very and eternal child-father relationship. The one characteristic of Jesus' teaching was that the morality of his philosophy originated in the personal relation of the individual to God, this very child-father relationship. Jesus placed emphasis on the individual, not on the race or nation. While eating supper, Jesus had the talk with Matthew in which he explained that the morality of any act is determined by the individual's motive. Jesus' morality was always positive. The golden rule, as restated by Jesus, demands active social contact. The older, negative rule could be obeyed in isolation. Jesus stripped morality of all rules and ceremonies and elevated it to majestic levels of spiritual thinking and truly righteous living. This new religion of Jesus was not without its practical implications, but whatever of practical, political, social, or economic value there is to be found in his teaching is the natural outworking of this inner experience of the soul as it manifests the fruits of the Spirit in the spontaneous daily ministry of genuine personal religious experience. After Jesus and Matthew had finished talking, Simon Zelotes asked, "But, Master, are all men the sons of God?" And Jesus answered, "Yes, Simon, all men are the sons of God, and that is the good news you are going to proclaim." But the apostles could not grasp such a doctrine. It was a new, strange, and startling announcement. And it was because of his desire to impress this truth upon them that Jesus taught his followers to treat all men as their brothers. In response to a question asked by Andrew, the Master made it clear that the morality of his teaching was inseparable from the religion of his living. He taught morality not from the nature of man, but from the relation of man to God. John asked Jesus, "Master, what is the kingdom of heaven?" And Jesus answered, "The kingdom of heaven consists in these three essentials. First, recognition of the fact of the sovereignty of God. Second, belief in the truth of sonship with God. And third, faith in the effectiveness of the supreme human desire to do the will of God, to be like God. And this is the good news of the gospel, that by faith every mortal may have all these essentials of salvation." And now the week of waiting was over, and they prepared to depart on the morrow for Jerusalem.
Paper 141. Beginning the Public Work. On the first day of the week, January 19, A.D. 27, Jesus and the 12 apostles made ready to depart from their headquarters in Bethsaida. The 12 knew nothing of their Master's plans, except that they were going up to Jerusalem to attend the Passover feast in April, and that it was the intention to journey by way of the Jordan Valley. They did not get away from Zebedee's house until near noon because the families of the apostles and others of the disciples had come to say goodbye and wish them well in the new work they were about to begin. Just before leaving, the apostles missed the Master, and Andrew went out to find him. After a brief search, he found Jesus sitting in a boat down the beach, and he was weeping. The 12 had often seen their Master when he seemed to grieve, and they had beheld his brief seasons of serious preoccupation of mind, but none of them had ever seen him weep. Andrew was somewhat startled to see the Master thus affected on the eve of their departure for Jerusalem, and he ventured to approach Jesus and ask, "On this great day, Master, when we are to depart for Jerusalem to proclaim the Father's kingdom, why is it that you weep? Which of us has offended you?" And Jesus, going back with Andrew to join the 12, answered him, "No one of you has grieved me. I am saddened only because none of my father Joseph's family have remembered to come over to bid us Godspeed." At this time, Ruth was on a visit to her brother Joseph at Nazareth. Other members of his family were kept away by pride, disappointment, misunderstanding, and petty resentment indulged as a result of hurt feelings. 1. Leaving Galilee. Capernaum was not far from Tiberias, and the fame of Jesus had begun to spread well over all of Galilee, and even to parts beyond. Jesus knew that Herod would soon begin to take notice of his work, so he thought best to journey south and into Judea with his apostles. A company of over 100 believers desired to go with them, but Jesus spoke to them and besought them not to accompany the apostolic group on their way down the Jordan. Though they consented to remain behind, many of them followed after the Master within a few days. The first day, Jesus and the apostles only journeyed as far as Tarikia, where they rested for the night. The next day they traveled to a point on the Jordan near Pella, where John had preached about 1 year before, and where Jesus had received baptism. Here they tarried for more than 2 weeks, teaching and preaching. By the end of the first week, several hundred people had assembled in a camp near where Jesus and the 12 dwelt, and they had come from Galilee, Phoenicia, Syria, the Decapolis, Perea, and Judea. Jesus did no public preaching. Andrew divided the multitude and assigned the preachers for the forenoon and afternoon assemblies. After the evening meal, Jesus talked with the 12. He taught them nothing new, but reviewed his former teaching and answered their many questions. On one of these evenings, he told the 12 something about the 40 days which he spent in the hills near this place. Many of those who came from Perea and Judea had been baptized by John and were interested in finding out more about Jesus' teachings. The apostles made much progress in teaching the disciples of John, inasmuch as they did not in any way detract from John's preaching, and since they did not at this time even baptize their new disciples. But it was always a stumbling stone to John's followers that Jesus, if he were all that John had announced, did nothing to get him out of prison. John's disciples never could understand why Jesus did not prevent the cruel death of their beloved leader. From night to night, Andrew carefully instructed his fellow apostles in the delicate and difficult task of getting along smoothly with the followers of John the Baptist. During this first year of Jesus' public ministry, more than 3/4 of his followers had previously followed John and had received his baptism. This entire year of AD 27 was spent in quietly taking over John's work in Perea and Judea. 2. God's law and the Father's will. The night before they left Pella, Jesus gave the apostles some further instruction with regard to the new kingdom. Said the Master, "You have been taught to look for the coming of the kingdom of God, and now I come announcing that this long-looked-for kingdom is near at hand, even that it is already here and in our midst. In every kingdom there must be a king seated upon his throne and decreeing the laws of the realm. And so have you developed a concept of the kingdom of heaven as a glorified rule of the Jewish people over all the peoples of the earth, with Messiah sitting on David's throne, and from this place of miraculous power promulgating the laws of all the world. But, my children, you see not with the eye of faith, and you hear not with the understanding of the Spirit. I declare that the kingdom of heaven is the realization and acknowledgement of God's rule within the hearts of men. True, there is a king in this kingdom, and that king is my father and your father. We are indeed his loyal subjects, but far transcending that fact is the transforming truth that we are his sons. In my life this truth is to become manifest to all. Our Father also sits upon a throne, but not one made with hands. The throne of the infinite is the eternal dwelling place of the Father in the heaven of heavens. He fills all things and proclaims his laws to universes upon universes. And the Father also rules within the hearts of his children on earth by the Spirit which he has sent to live within the souls of mortal men. When you are the subjects of this kingdom, you indeed are made to hear the law of the universe ruler. But when, because of the gospel of the kingdom which I have come to declare, you faith discover yourselves as sons, you henceforth look not upon yourselves as law-subject creatures of an all-powerful king, but as privileged sons of a loving and divine Father. Verily, verily, I say to you, when the Father's will is your law, you are hardly in the kingdom. But when the Father's will becomes truly your will, then are you in very truth in the kingdom, because the kingdom has thereby become an established experience in you. When God's will is your law, you are noble slave subjects. But when you believe in this new gospel of divine sonship, my Father's will becomes your will, and you are elevated to the high position of the free children of God, liberated sons of the kingdom. Some of the apostles grasped something of this teaching, but none of them comprehended the full significance of this tremendous announcement, unless it was James Zebedee. But these words sank into their hearts and came forth to gladden their ministry during later years of service. 3. The sojourn at Amathus. The Master and his apostles remained near Amathus for almost 3 weeks. The apostles continued to preach twice daily to the multitude, and Jesus preached each Sabbath afternoon. It became impossible to continue the Wednesday playtime, so Andrew arranged that 2 apostles should rest each day of the 6 days in the week, while all were on duty during the Sabbath services. Peter, James, and John did most of the public preaching. Philip, Nathanael, Thomas, and Simon did much of the personal work and conducted classes for special groups of inquirers. The twins continued their general police supervision, while Andrew, Matthew, and Judas developed into a general managerial committee of 3, although each of these 3 also did considerable religious work. Andrew was much occupied with the task of adjusting the constantly recurring misunderstandings and disagreements between the disciples of John and the newer disciples of Jesus. Serious situations would arise every few days, but Andrew, with the assistance of his apostolic associates, managed to induce the contending parties to come to some sort of agreement, at least temporarily. Jesus refused to participate in any of these conferences. Neither would he give any advice about the proper adjustment of these difficulties. He never once offered a suggestion as to how the apostles should solve these perplexing problems. When Andrew came to Jesus with these questions, he would always say, "It is not wise for the host to participate in the family troubles of his guests. A wise parent never takes sides in the petty quarrels of his own children." The Master displayed great wisdom and manifested perfect fairness in all of his dealings with his apostles and with all of his disciples. Jesus was truly a master of men. He exercised great influence over his fellow men because of the combined charm and force of his personality. There was a subtle commanding influence in his rugged, nomadic, and homeless life. There was intellectual attractiveness and spiritual drawing power in his authoritative manner of teaching, in his lucid logic, his strength of reasoning, his sagacious insight, his alertness of mind, his matchless poise, and his sublime tolerance. He was simple, manly, honest, and fearless. With all of this physical and intellectual influence manifest in the Master's presence, there are also all those spiritual charms of being which have become associated with his personality: patience, tenderness, meekness, gentleness, and humility. Jesus of Nazareth was indeed a strong and forceful personality. He was an intellectual power and a spiritual stronghold. His personality not only appealed to the spiritually minded women among his followers, but also to the educated and intellectual Nicodemus, and to the hardy Roman soldier, the captain stationed on guard at the cross, who, when he had finished watching the Master die, said, "Truly, this was a Son of God." And red-blooded, rugged Galilean fishermen called him Master. The pictures of Jesus have been most unfortunate. These paintings of the Christ have exerted a deleterious influence on youth. The temple merchants would hardly have fled before Jesus if he had been such a man as your artists usually have depicted. His was a dignified manhood. He was good, but natural. Jesus did not pose as a mild, sweet, gentle, and kindly mystic. His teaching was thrillingly dynamic. He not only meant well, but he went about actually doing good. The Master never said, "Come to me, all you who are indolent and all who are dreamers," but he did many times say, "Come to me, all you who labor, and I will give you rest, spiritual strength." The Master's yoke is indeed easy, but even so, he never imposes it. Every individual must take this yoke of his own free will. Jesus portrayed conquest by sacrifice, the sacrifice of pride and selfishness. By showing mercy, he meant to portray spiritual deliverance from all grudges, grievances, anger, and the lust for selfish power and revenge. And when he said, "Resist not evil," he later explained that he did not mean to condone sin or to counsel fraternity with iniquity. He intended the more to teach forgiveness, to resist not evil treatment of one's personality, evil injury to one's feelings of personal dignity. 4. Teaching about the Father. While sojourning at Amathus, Jesus spent much time with the apostles instructing them in the new concept of God. Again and again did he impress upon them that God is a Father, not a great and supreme bookkeeper who is chiefly engaged in making damaging entries against his erring children on earth, recordings of sin and evil to be used against them when he subsequently sits in judgment upon them as the just judge of all creation. The Jews had long conceived of God as a king over all, even as a father of the nation, but never before had large numbers of mortal men held the idea of God as a loving father of the individual. In answer to Thomas's question, "Who is this God of the kingdom?" Jesus replied, "God is your Father, and religion, my gospel, is nothing more nor less than the believing recognition of the truth that you are his Son. And I am here among you in the flesh to make clear both of these ideas in my life and teachings." Jesus also sought to free the minds of his apostles from the idea of offering animal sacrifices as a religious duty. But these men trained in the religion of the daily sacrifice were slow to comprehend what he meant. Nevertheless, the Master did not grow weary in his teaching. When he failed to reach the minds of all of the apostles by means of one illustration, he would restate his message and employ another type of parable for purposes of illumination. At this same time, Jesus began to teach the 12 more fully concerning their mission to comfort the afflicted and minister to the sick. The Master taught them much about the whole man, the union of body, mind, and spirit, to form the individual man or woman. Jesus told his associates about the 3 forms of affliction they would meet and went on to explain how they should minister to all who suffer the sorrows of human sickness. He taught them to recognize 1. Diseases of the flesh, those afflictions commonly regarded as physical sickness. 2. troubled minds, those non-physical afflictions, which were subsequently looked upon as emotional and mental difficulties and disturbances. 3. The possession of evil spirits. Jesus explained to his apostles on several occasions the nature and something concerning the origin of these evil spirits, in that day often also called unclean spirits. The Master well knew the difference between the possession of evil spirits and insanity, but the apostles did not. Neither was it possible, in view of their limited knowledge of the early history of Urantia, for Jesus to undertake to make this matter fully understandable. But he many times said to them, alluding to these evil spirits, "They shall no more molest men when I shall have ascended to my Father in heaven, and after I shall have poured out my Spirit upon all flesh, in those times when the kingdom will come in great power and spiritual glory." From week to week and from month to month throughout this entire year, the apostles paid more and more attention to the healing ministry of the sick. 5. Spiritual unity. One of the most eventful of all the evening conferences at Amathus was the session having to do with the discussion of spiritual unity. James Zebedee had asked, "Master, how shall we learn to see alike and thereby enjoy more harmony among ourselves?" When Jesus heard this question, he was stirred within his spirit, so much so that he replied, "James, James, when did I teach you that you should all see alike? I have come into the world to proclaim spiritual liberty to the end that mortals may be empowered to live individual lives of originality and freedom before God. I do not desire that social harmony and fraternal peace shall be purchased by the sacrifice of free personality and spiritual originality. What I require of you, my apostles, is spirit unity, and that you can experience in the joy of your united dedication to the wholehearted doing of the will of my Father in heaven. You do not have to see alike or feel alike or even think alike in order spiritually to be alike. Spiritual unity is derived from the consciousness that each of you is indwelt and increasingly dominated by the spirit gift of the Heavenly Father. Your apostolic harmony must grow out of the fact that the spirit hope of each of you is identical in origin, nature, and destiny. In this way you may experience a perfected unity of spirit purpose and spirit understanding, growing out of the mutual consciousness of the identity of each of your indwelling paradise spirits. And you may enjoy all of this profound spiritual unity in the very face of the utmost diversity of your individual attitudes of intellectual thinking, temperamental feeling, and social conduct. Your personalities may be refreshingly diverse and markedly different, while your spiritual natures and spirit fruits of divine worship and brotherly love may be so unified that all who behold your lives will of a surety take cognizance of this spirit identity and soul unity. They will recognize that you have been with me and have thereby learned unacceptably how to do the will of the Father in heaven. You can achieve the unity of the service of God even while you render such service in accordance with the technique of your own original endowments of mind, body, and soul. Your spirit unity implies two things which always will be found to harmonize in the lives of individual believers. First, you are possessed with a common motive for life service. You all desire above everything to do the will of the Father in heaven. Second, you all have a common goal of existence. You all purpose to find the Father in heaven, thereby proving to the universe that you have become like him. Many times during the training of the 12, Jesus reverted to this theme. Repeatedly, he told them it was not his desire that those who believed in him should become dogmatized and standardized in accordance with the religious interpretations of even good men. Again and again he warned his apostles against the formulation of creeds and the establishment of traditions as a means of guiding and controlling believers in the gospel of the kingdom. 6. Last week at Amathus. Near the end of the last week at Amathus, Simon Zelotes brought to Jesus one Teherma, a Persian doing business at Damascus. Herma had heard of Jesus and had come to Capernaum to see him, and there learning that Jesus had gone with his apostles down the Jordan on the way to Jerusalem, he set out to find him. Andrew had presented Herma to Simon for instruction. Simon looked upon the Persian as a fire worshipper, although Herma took great pains to explain that fire was only the visible symbol of the pure and holy one. After talking with Jesus, the Persian signified his intention of remaining for several days to hear the teaching and listen to the preaching. When Simon Zelotes and Jesus were alone, Simon asked the Master, "Why is it that I could not persuade him? Why did he so resist me and so readily lend an ear to you?" Jesus answered, "Simon, Simon, how many times have I instructed you to refrain from all efforts to take something out of the hearts of those who seek salvation? How often have I told you to labor only to put something into these hungry souls? Lead men into the kingdom, and the great and living truths of the kingdom will presently drive out all serious error. When you have presented to mortal man the good news that God is his Father, you can the easier persuade him that he is in reality a Son of God, and having done that, you have brought the light of salvation to the one who sits in darkness. Simon, when the Son of Man came first to you, did he come denouncing Moses and the prophets and proclaiming a new and better way of life? No, I came not to take away that which you had from your forefathers, but to show you the perfected vision of that which your fathers saw only in part. Go then, Simon, teaching and preaching the kingdom, and when you have a man safely and securely within the kingdom, then is the time when such a one shall come to you with inquiries, to impart instruction having to do with the progressive advancement of the soul within the divine kingdom." Simon was astonished at these words, but he did as Jesus had instructed him, and Herma the Persian was numbered among those who entered the kingdom. That night Jesus discoursed to the apostles on the new life in the kingdom. He said in part, "When you enter the kingdom, you are reborn. You cannot teach the deep things of the Spirit to those who have been born only of the flesh. First see that men are born of the Spirit before you seek to instruct them in the advanced ways of the Spirit. Do not undertake to show men the beauties of the temple until you have first taken them into the temple. Introduce men to God, and as the sons of God, before you discourse on the doctrines of the fatherhood of God and the sonship of men. Do not strive with men, always be patient. It is not your kingdom. You are only ambassadors. Simply go forth proclaiming, 'This is the kingdom of heaven. God is your Father, and you are his sons, and this good news, if you wholeheartedly believe it, is your eternal salvation.'" The apostles made great progress during the sojourn at Amathus, but they were very much disappointed that Jesus would give them no suggestions about dealing with John's disciples. Even in the important matter of baptism, all that Jesus said was, "John did indeed baptize with water, but when you enter the kingdom of heaven, you shall be baptized with the Spirit." 7. At Bethany beyond Jordan. On February 26, Jesus, his apostles, and a large group of followers journeyed down the Jordan to the ford near Bethany in Perea, the place where John first made proclamation of the coming kingdom. Jesus, with his apostles, remained here, teaching and preaching for 4 weeks before they went on up to Jerusalem. The second week of the sojourn at Bethany beyond Jordan, Jesus took Peter, James, and John into the hills across the river and south of Jericho for a 3 days' rest. The Master taught these 3 many new and advanced truths about the kingdom of heaven. For the purpose of this record, we will reorganize and classify these teachings as follows. Jesus endeavored to make clear that he desired his disciples, having tasted of the good spirit realities of the kingdom, so to live in the world that men, by seeing their lives, would become kingdom-conscious and hence be led to inquire of believers concerning the ways of the kingdom. All such sincere seekers for the truth are always glad to hear the glad tidings of the faith gift which ensures admission to the kingdom with its eternal and divine spirit realities. The Master sought to impress upon all teachers of the gospel of the kingdom that their only business was to reveal God to the individual man as his Father, to lead this individual man to become Son-conscious, then to present this same man to God as his faith Son. Both of these essential revelations are accomplished in Jesus. He became indeed the way, the truth, and the life. The religion of Jesus was wholly based on the living of his bestowal life on earth. When Jesus departed from this world, he left behind no books, laws, or other forms of human organization affecting the religious life of the individual. Jesus made it plain that he had come to establish personal and eternal relations with men, which should forever take precedence over all other human relationships, and he emphasized that this intimate spiritual fellowship was to be extended to all men of all ages and of all social conditions among all peoples. The only reward which he held out for his children was, in this world, spiritual joy and divine communion; in the next world, eternal life in the progress of the divine spirit realities of the Paradise Father. Jesus laid great emphasis upon what he called the two truths of first import in the teachings of the kingdom, and they are the attainment of salvation by faith and faith alone, associated with the revolutionary teaching of the attainment of human liberty through the sincere recognition of truth. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Jesus was the truth made manifest in the flesh, and he promised to send his Spirit of truth into the hearts of all his children after his return to the Father in heaven. The Master was teaching these apostles the essentials of truth for an entire age on earth. They often listened to his teachings when in reality what he said was intended for the inspiration and edification of other worlds. He exemplified a new and original plan of life. From the human standpoint, he was indeed a Jew, but he lived his life for all the world as a mortal of the realm. To ensure the recognition of his Father in the unfolding of the plan of the kingdom, Jesus explained that he had purposely ignored the great men of earth. He began his work with the poor, the very class which had been so neglected by most of the evolutionary religions of preceding times. He despised no man. His plan was worldwide, even universal. He was so bold and emphatic in these announcements that even Peter, James, and John were tempted to think he might possibly be beside himself. He sought mildly to impart to these apostles the truth that he had come on this bestowal mission not to set an example for a few earth creatures, but to establish and demonstrate a standard of human life for all peoples upon all worlds throughout his entire universe. And this standard approached the highest perfection, even the final goodness of the universal Father. But the apostles could not grasp the meaning of his words. He announced that he had come to function as a teacher sent from heaven to present spiritual truth to the material mind. And this is exactly what he did. He was a teacher, not a preacher. From the human viewpoint, Peter was a much more effective preacher than Jesus. Jesus' preaching was so effective because of his unique personality, not so much because of compelling oratory or emotional appeal. Jesus spoke directly to men's souls. He was a teacher of man's spirit, but through the mind, he lived with men. It was on this occasion that Jesus intimated to Peter, James, and John that his work on earth was in some respects to be limited by the commission of his associate on high, referring to the pre-bestowal instructions of his paradise brother Emmanuel. He told them that he had come to do his Father's will, and only his Father's will. Being thus motivated by a wholehearted singleness of purpose, he was not anxiously bothered by the evil in the world. The apostles were beginning to recognize the unaffected friendliness of Jesus. Though the Master was easy of approach, He always lived independent of and above all human beings. Not for one moment was he ever dominated by any purely mortal influence or subject to frail human judgment. He paid no attention to public opinion, and he was uninfluenced by praise. He seldom paused to correct misunderstandings or to resent misrepresentation. He never asked any man for advice. He never made requests for prayers. James was astonished at how Jesus seemed to see the end from the beginning. The Master rarely appeared to be surprised. He was never excited, vexed, or disconcerted. He never apologized to any man. He was at times saddened, but never discouraged. More clearly, John recognized that, notwithstanding all of his divine endowments, after all, he was human. Jesus lived as a man among men, and understood, loved, and knew how to manage men. In his personal life, he was so human, and yet so faultless. And he was always unselfish. Although Peter, James, and John could not understand very much of what Jesus said on this occasion, his gracious words lingered in their hearts, and after the crucifixion and resurrection they came forth greatly to enrich and gladden their subsequent ministry. No wonder these apostles did not fully comprehend the Master's words, for he was projecting to them the plan of a new age. 8. Working in Jericho. Throughout the 4-week sojourn at Bethany beyond Jordan, several times each week, Andrew would assign apostolic couples to go up to Jericho for a day or two. John had many believers in Jericho, and the majority of them welcomed the more advanced teachings of Jesus and his apostles. On these Jericho visits, the apostles began more specifically to carry out Jesus' instructions to minister to the sick. They visited every house in the city and sought to comfort every afflicted person. The apostles did some public work in Jericho, but their efforts were chiefly of a more quiet and personal nature. They now made the discovery that the good news of the kingdom was very comforting to the sick, that their message carried healing for the afflicted, and it was in Jericho that Jesus commissioned to the 12 to preach the glad tidings of the kingdom and minister to the afflicted was first fully carried into effect. They stopped in Jericho on the way up to Jerusalem and were overtaken by a delegation from Mesopotamia that had come to confer with Jesus. The apostles had planned to spend but a day here, but when these truth-seekers from the east arrived, Jesus spent 3 days with them, and they returned to their various homes along the Euphrates, happy in the knowledge of the new truths of the kingdom of heaven. 9. Departing for Jerusalem. On Monday, the last day of March, Jesus and the apostles began their journey up the hills toward Jerusalem. Lazarus of Bethany had been down to the Jordan twice to see Jesus, and every arrangement had been made for the Master and his apostles to make their headquarters with Lazarus and his sisters at Bethany, as long as they might desire to stay in Jerusalem. The disciples of John remained at Bethany beyond the Jordan, teaching and baptizing the multitudes, so that Jesus was accompanied only by the 12 when he arrived at Lazarus's home. Here Jesus and the apostles tarried for 5 days, resting and refreshing themselves before going on to Jerusalem for the Passover. It was a great event in the lives of Martha and Mary to have the Master and his apostles in the home of their brother, where they could minister to their needs. On Sunday morning, April 6, Jesus and the apostles went down to Jerusalem, and this was the first time the Master and all of the 12 had been there together.